The free will paradox. Before you made the decision to lie down tonight, something in your brain had already decided. Not you exactly, but the neurons, the chemistry, the cascading electrical signals that produce what you experience as thought. By the time you felt like you were choosing, the choice was already in motion somewhere below the level of awareness. You were watching a decision arrive rather than making one. Neuroscientist Benjamin Libet ran experiments in the 1980s where he asked people to flick their wrist whenever they felt like it while watching a clock. He measured when the brain's readiness potential, the electrical buildup that precedes voluntary movement, began, and he found that it started about half a second before the person reported feeling the urge to move. The decision appeared in the brain before the person knew they had made it. Half a second does not sound like much, but think about what it means. The experience of choosing, the felt sense of "I am about to do this," arrived after the process that produced the action had already begun. You were not the author of the decision. You were the audience watching it unfold. And yet you feel, right now, with complete certainty, that you are choosing, that you could have stayed up tonight instead of lying here, that tomorrow you could choose differently from how you chose today. That sense of authorship over your own actions is so immediate and so convincing that it is almost impossible to argue yourself out of it, even when you know about Libet's experiments. The feeling of free will is real. What is less clear is whether the feeling corresponds to anything. Philosophers have been tangling with this for thousands of years before neuroscience got involved. Either your choices are caused by prior events, by your genetics, your upbringing, your brain chemistry, a specific configuration of your neurons at that moment, or they are not. If they are caused by prior events, then they were going to happen regardless of what you felt about them. The prior events were caused by earlier events, going back before you were born. You did not choose your brain. You did not choose the experiences that shaped it. You did not choose who you are. So how could you have chosen differently from how you chose? And if your choices are not caused by prior events, if there is some genuine randomness in how they arise, that does not help either. A random choice is not a free choice. Nobody thinks freedom means acting randomly. If your decisions are partly the result of quantum noise in your neurons, that does not give you more control. It gives you less. So freedom seems to disappear in both directions. If determined, your choices were always going to be what they were. If random, your choices are not really yours. Neither option leaves room for the thing we actually want when we talk about free will, which is genuine authorship, the sense that you, the real you, the one that thinks and reflects and cares about things, is actually in charge. Compatibilists argue that the whole framing is wrong. Freedom, they say, does not require that your choices be uncaused. It only requires that they flow from the right kind of cause, namely your own desires, values, and reasoning, rather than from external compulsion. A person who acts from their genuine values and reflective judgment is free, even if those values were shaped by things they did not choose, because the shaping produced a person who is genuinely the author of their own reasoning. But there is a version of this that never quite settles. Even if compatibilism is right and freedom just means acting from your own character, your character was built by things outside your control. You did not choose your temperament. You did not choose the family you were born into or the experiences that most deeply shaped you. The person whose character is doing the causing was produced by a chain of events that stretches back before you existed, which means the you that is supposedly doing the choosing is itself something that happened to you before you were in any position to choose. Some people find this liberating rather than threatening. If you could not have been otherwise than you are, then guilt about who you are loses its grip. Blame becomes a strange concept. If the person who made the terrible choice was always going to make it, given who they were and what they had been through, then what exactly is being punished? Others find it unbearable. The feeling of genuine responsibility, of being the real author of your own life, is not something most people are willing to let go of for the sake of logical consistency. Even people who intellectually accept determinism tend to keep behaving as if they have choices, as if their deliberations matter, as if they could do otherwise, because behaving any other way is not really possible from the inside of a life being lived. The debate about free will is not just philosophical. It has consequences for how societies are organized, how legal systems work, how we treat people who do terrible things. Every time society has to decide how much weight to give to the circumstances that shaped a person's choices, it is quietly wrestling with the free will paradox without naming it. And individually, every time you feel guilt, every time you hold yourself accountable, every time you resolve to do better, you are behaving as if the paradox resolves in favor of freedom. Not because you have solved it, but because you have to live, and living requires acting as if your choices matter. Maybe that is the most honest thing the free will paradox reveals. Not that free will is real or that it is an illusion, but that the question might not be answerable from where you are standing. You are inside the system you are trying to evaluate. You are using the very faculty whose freedom is in question to evaluate whether that faculty is free. Whether the choice you made tonight was truly yours, or whether it was the inevitable output of everything that came before. The experience of making it was real. The weight of it was real. Whether that is enough to call it free is the question nobody has managed to close. There is one more wrinkle worth sitting with. The free will paradox is not static. Neuroscience keeps adding new layers to it. More recent research has complicated Libet's findings, with some studies suggesting that people can veto an action after the readiness potential has started, which might preserve some form of conscious control, even if initiation is unconscious. Others have questioned whether the readiness potential really measures what Libet thought it measured. The science is messier than the clean narrative suggests. But the philosophical problem underneath the science does not go away when the experimental details get complicated. Whether or not Libet's specific findings hold up perfectly, the deeper question remains. If your brain is a physical system running according to physical laws, what exactly is doing the choosing? And if the answer is the brain, then who is the brain choosing for? Is there a you that is separate from the brain that has preferences about what the brain should do? Or are you just another process running inside the same physical system, feeling like you are in charge while the system does what it was always going to do? Philosophy does not have a clean answer. Neuroscience does not have one either. And the experience of living, of actually inhabiting a life with decisions and consequences and things you wish you had done differently, keeps generating the same stubborn feeling that it matters what you choose. Maybe the paradox is not a problem to solve. Maybe it is just the texture of being a conscious thing in a physical universe, the friction between what you feel and what the physics suggests, and that friction, uncomfortable as it is, might be one of the more honest things about being alive. What would it change about how you live if you genuinely believed, not just intellectually but in your bones, that every choice you have ever made was always going to happen exactly as it did? The arrow paradox. Picture an arrow in flight. Right now, at this exact moment, the arrow occupies a specific position in space. It is here, not there. Its location is definite. And at the very next moment, it will be in a slightly different position, also definite, also specific. But here is what Zeno of Elea noticed around 450 BC, and what has been making philosophers uncomfortable ever since. At any single instant, the arrow is not moving. Motion requires time. An instant has no duration. So at any given instant, the arrow is simply occupying a space equal to itself, sitting still, completely motionless. And if you take every instant in the arrow's flight, you get an infinite collection of motionless arrows. Add up an infinite number of motionless things, and you should still get motionlessness. And yet the arrow moves. You can watch it move. You can feel it land. Motion is real and observable and undeniable. But Zeno's argument, taken on its own terms, seems to show that motion is impossible. Something in the reasoning must be wrong. But finding exactly what is wrong is harder than it looks. The standard modern resolution comes from calculus. When Newton and Leibniz developed calculus in the 17th century, they gave mathematics the tools to handle instantaneous rates of change. Velocity at an instant is not zero. It is defined as the limit of the ratio of distance to time as the time interval shrinks towards zero. Even at a single instant, an object can have a non-zero velocity, defined as the derivative of its position with respect to time. So the arrow at any instant has a position and a velocity. The velocity is not zero just because the instant has no duration. The velocity is a property of how the position is changing, described mathematically as a limiting process that does not require the instant to have any thickness. Problem solved, you might think. But there is something philosophically unsatisfying about this resolution that has kept the debate going for centuries. Calculus tells us how to calculate the arrow's velocity at an instant. It gives us a number, but does that number correspond to anything physically real at that instant, or is it just a useful mathematical abstraction that lets us make accurate predictions? At any single frozen instant, the arrow is where it is. Nothing is happening. How can it have a velocity? Velocity describes change over time, and at a single instant, there is no time for anything to change. The calculus answer is mathematically clean, but it sidesteps the physical question of what velocity actually is at an instant, rather than across an interval. Philosopher of physics David Albert has argued that this is a genuine puzzle about the physical world, not just a mathematical quirk. If we take the arrow seriously as a physical object existing in time, the question of what it is doing at any single moment is not obviously answered by calculus. Calculus tells us what we can calculate. Whether the calculation refers to something ontologically real is a separate question. Some physicists point to quantum mechanics as potentially relevant here. At the quantum level, position and momentum are conjugate variables, related by the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. The more precisely you know where a particle is, the less precisely you can know its momentum, and vice versa. A particle with a perfectly definite position has completely indefinite momentum. So at the quantum level, the idea of a particle simultaneously having a precise position and a precise velocity is already ruled out by physics. The arrow paradox, which seems to assume both, may be pointing at a genuine feature of reality. But even at the classical level, before quantum mechanics enters the picture, the paradox is still interesting because of what it reveals about the concept of an instant. We talk about instants all the time as if they are unproblematic. We say at this moment or right now, and we feel like those phrases pick out something real. But an instant with zero duration is a mathematical idealization. Real physical time might not work that way. If time is quantized at some fundamental level, if there is a smallest possible unit of time below which nothing can happen, then the idea of a motionless arrow at an instant dissolves, because there are no true instants, only very short intervals. Nobody knows if time is quantized. The Planck time, about 10 to the power of minus 43 seconds, is often cited as the smallest meaningful unit of time in current physics. But whether time is genuinely discrete, or whether the Planck time is just a scale below which our current theories break down, is an open question. Zeno designed the arrow paradox not because he was confused about whether arrows move, but because he was trying to make a philosophical point about the nature of time, space, and motion. His target was the idea that reality consists of discrete moments strung together like beads on a string. If that is what time is, he argued, then motion becomes impossible to make sense of, because at each bead nothing is happening. His conclusion was that motion and change are illusions, and that the underlying reality is static and unchanging. Most people reject that conclusion. Motion is too obviously real to abandon. But the paradox survives the rejection because it correctly identifies a tension in how we think about continuous time and instantaneous states, and that tension has not been fully resolved by any framework we currently have. An arrow flies across a room and sticks in the wall. Every moment of its flight, from here to there, it was in some specific location. At every one of those locations it was, for that instant, not moving. And yet somehow all those frozen moments add up to a flight. How does a collection of frozen moments produce something that moves? And is your answer to that question actually an explanation, or just a very confident description of something you have decided not to be puzzled by? There is something else the arrow paradox points at that is worth following a little further. Zeno lived in a world before calculus, before physics as we know it, before any mathematical tools existed for handling infinity or limits. He was working with the conceptual resources available in ancient Greece, which were considerable but different from ours. And yet the problem he identified is not one that our additional tools have simply eliminated. They have given us better ways of calculating around it. Whether they have given us better ways of understanding it is less clear. The 20th century philosopher Henry Bergson took this seriously. He argued that the real error in Zeno's paradox is not mathematical but conceptual. We are trying to reconstruct motion from static snapshots, he said, and motion is precisely what cannot be captured in a snapshot. A photograph of a dancer is not dancing. A frame from a film is not a film. Motion is a continuous process, and the moment you freeze it into a series of instants, you have already lost the thing you were trying to understand. Bergson's solution was to take duration seriously as a fundamental feature of reality rather than analyzing it into a series of nows. Time, he argued, is not a series of points. It is a flow. And that flow cannot be broken into pieces without destroying what makes it a flow. Most physicists find this unsatisfying because it resists mathematical formulation. But as a description of what the arrow paradox feels like from the inside, from the perspective of actually experiencing time rather than modeling it, Bergson's account has a quality that the calculus resolution lacks. Nobody experiences their life as a series of frozen instants. Every moment has the feeling of moving toward the next one. Duration feels like something, and the paradox is asking whether that feeling accurately represents the structure of time or whether it is just a feature of how minds process a world that is actually made of static states. Whether the world is made of static states, of genuine flowing duration, or of something else entirely that our current concepts cannot quite capture, is still genuinely open. The arrow is still in flight, and we are still not entirely sure what that means. The silence paradox. Imagine a room so quiet that you can hear your own heartbeat. Not quiet in the ordinary sense, not just free of traffic noise and conversation, but genuinely, measurably, profoundly silent. The kind of silence that starts to feel thick after a few minutes, the kind that makes people uncomfortable. Now someone in that room says, out loud, "This room is perfectly silent," and instantly it is not. The sentence that describes the silence destroys it. The observation and the observed cannot coexist. You cannot comment on perfect silence without ending it. The act of noting the silence is the act of breaking it. This is the silence paradox, and it is simpler than most paradoxes, which is partly what makes it interesting. You do not need centuries of philosophy or advanced mathematics to see it. You just need to notice that some states of the world are destroyed by the attempt to describe them. The description and the described are in fundamental conflict. At first, this seems like a trivial observation. Of course, you cannot be silent while talking about silence. Just do not talk. Problem solved. But the paradox is not really about whether you can choose to stay quiet. It is about a deeper structural problem with certain kinds of self-referential statements. Any statement about the current state of a system changes the current state of that system, at least if the statement is made within the system it is describing. Consider some related examples that follow the same shape. A relationship that is going well precisely because neither person is analyzing whether it is going well. The moment one of them says, "Are we good?" the answer is slightly less certain than it was before the question, because the question implies a doubt that was not there a moment ago. The asking changes the state of the thing being asked about, or a mood. You are content, not thinking about it, just experiencing it. Then you notice the contentment and think about it, and the act of self-observation introduces a slight self-consciousness that the original state did not contain. You are still content, maybe, but it is a slightly different quality of contentment now, observed rather than simply lived. Psychologists call something related to this the observer effect in human behavior, distinct from the quantum mechanical version, though they share a structural similarity. When people know they are being observed, they behave differently. When you tell someone you are watching how they handle a stressful situation, the watching changes how they handle it. The measurement contaminates the thing being measured. John Cage, the composer who spent his career thinking seriously about silence, famously spent time in an anechoic chamber, a room designed to absorb virtually all sound, in the early 1950s. He expected to experience complete silence. Instead, he heard two sounds, one high and one low. A technician told him the high sound was his nervous system in operation and the low sound was his blood circulating. He concluded that silence in the absolute sense does not exist for a living person. As long as you are alive, you are making sound. The silence you seek is always contaminated by the fact of your seeking it. Cage used this experience to argue that all sounds are equally valid as music, that the boundary between music and noise is an arbitrary human construction, and that silence is not the absence of sound, but a different relationship to sound. He wrote a piece called 4 minutes and 33 seconds, in which a pianist sits at a piano for that duration without playing a single note. The piece is not silence. It is the ambient sounds of the room, the audience, the building, the world outside, reframed as music by the context of a performance. The piece about silence is not silent. It is full of sound that the framing makes audible. What Cage stumbled onto in that anechoic chamber connects to the silence paradox in a precise way. Silence, in the absolute sense, requires the absence of an observer. The moment an observer is present, there is no silence, because the observer makes sound simply by existing as a biological system. And the moment an observer comments on the silence, the comment itself adds to the noise. Perfect silence can only exist where there is no one to notice it. which means no one can ever experience perfect silence, because experiencing requires an experiencer, and an experiencer is a noise-making system. The silence you have ever come closest to was always already compromised by you. Some philosophers extend this into questions about knowledge and consciousness more broadly. Any act of attention changes the thing being attended to, at least in human experience. You cannot observe yourself neutrally. You cannot watch your own thought process without the watching becoming part of the process. You cannot step outside your own experience to evaluate it from a neutral position, because the stepping outside is itself an experience. The silence paradox is a small and accessible version of a much larger problem about self-reference. Systems that try to describe or observe themselves always run into some version of the same wall. The description is part of what is being described. The observation changes what is being observed. The word about the thing is never quite separate from the thing it is about. Wittgenstein said something close to this when he wrote that whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. His point was that some things, perhaps the most important things, resist being said without being distorted by the saying. Not because they are beyond comprehension, but because language puts them at a remove from themselves. The map is not the territory. The word silence is not silent. What is the thing you most want to understand about your own experience that might disappear the moment you try to put it into words? And does the fact that it might disappear tell you something about what it actually is? There is a version of the silence paradox that operates in therapy and in meditation, and it is worth spending a moment with because it shows how the paradox is not just an abstract puzzle, but something that affects how people actually try to understand themselves. In certain meditation traditions, the goal is to observe thoughts without engaging with them, to watch the mind without becoming the mind, to be the witness rather than the participant. This sounds straightforward until you try it. Because the moment you try to observe your thoughts without engaging with them, the trying is a thought, the observing is a thought, the noticing that you have stopped observing is a thought. The silence you are trying to find keeps getting displaced by the act of looking for it. Teachers in these traditions often say that the solution is to stop trying, that the silence arrives on its own when the seeking ceases, but then you try to stop trying, which is itself a form of trying. And around it goes. The same structure appears in therapy. You want to understand why you keep doing something. You examine it carefully. You think about it, analyze it, discuss it, and sometimes the examination itself changes the behavior, not because you have found an insight that resolves it, but because attention to a pattern shifts the pattern. Other times the examination makes things worse, because bringing something into conscious focus adds an anxiety that was not present when it was operating below attention. Understanding and experiencing are different things. Sometimes they are compatible, and sometimes they are in active conflict. The silence paradox is pointing at the cases where they conflict, where the understanding requires a kind of attention that changes what is being understood. You cannot hear silence. You can only hear the boundary where silence used to be, and something similar might be true of consciousness itself, of the quality of experience that is always present, but always seems to slip away the moment you turn directly toward it. What would it sound like if you could actually hear nothing? And is the fact that you cannot hear it evidence that nothing is not there, or evidence that hearing requires something to be there? The Socratic Paradox. Socrates was considered the wisest man in Athens, not by himself, by the oracle at Delphi, which was about as authoritative as things got in ancient Greece. When someone told him this, Socrates was apparently puzzled because he did not feel particularly wise. So he went around Athens talking to people who were widely considered knowledgeable, politicians, poets, craftsmen, and tried to figure out why they were considered wise and he was not. What he found disturbed him. The politicians turned out not to know what justice actually was, even though they spent their lives making laws about it. The poets could not explain the meaning of their own verses. The craftsmen knew their trades well, but assumed that their expertise in one area gave them knowledge in others where they actually had none. Everyone Socrates talked to believed they knew things they did not know, and Socrates realized that the oracle might have been right, not because he knew more than these people, but because he was at least aware that he did not know. He was ignorant and knew it. They were ignorant and did not. And that difference, small as it sounds, turned out to matter enormously. The phrase that came from this, "I know that I know nothing," or more precisely, "I know only that I know nothing," is one of the most quoted lines in the history of philosophy. It is also, in a specific way, self-undermining. If you know nothing, then you know that, so you know something. If you know that you know nothing, then you have some knowledge, namely the knowledge of your own ignorance. Which means the statement is either false or paradoxical depending on how seriously you take it. Socrates almost certainly did not mean the statement in its most literal form. He did not think he knew literally nothing. He knew basic facts about the world like anyone else. What he meant was something more specific, that he lacked genuine understanding of the important things, the nature of virtue, justice, beauty, courage, the good life. On those questions, the ones that matter most, he felt genuinely ignorant. But even in that more careful form, the statement contains a puzzle. How do you know that you do not understand something? Understanding and not understanding can sometimes be hard to tell apart from the inside. You might feel like you understand something when you do not. Equally, you might feel confused about something you actually grasp quite well. The feeling of understanding is not a reliable guide to whether understanding is actually present. Socrates believed that most people mistake familiarity for understanding. You have heard the word justice your whole life. You have a rough sense of what it means. You can use it in sentences that other people accept as sensible. You feel comfortable with it. And that comfort, that familiarity, creates the impression of understanding even when genuine understanding is absent. The Socratic method, the famous practice of asking questions until contradictions appear, was designed to expose this gap. Not to humiliate, though it sometimes did, but to show people that the concepts they were most confident about were the ones they had thought least carefully about. Confidence about a concept is often inversely related to how carefully the concept has been examined. This remains true. The things people are most certain about tend to be the things they have thought about least. The beliefs inherited from upbringing, culture, or social environment often arrive with such force and such apparent obviousness that they never get questioned the way more exotic or uncomfortable ideas do. And the unquestioned beliefs are often the ones that do the most work in shaping how a person sees everything else. What Socrates was doing, underneath the philosophical theater of the marketplace conversations, was trying to get people to notice what they were assuming. Not their surface opinions, which they knew they had, but the deeper assumptions those opinions rested on. The things so obvious they had never been said aloud. The things so fundamental they had never been examined. And almost invariably, when those assumptions were examined, they turned out to be much shakier than anyone had realized. The paradox of the statement, "I know that I know nothing," is not just logical. It is experiential. Anyone who has gone through a period of genuine intellectual development knows the feeling it describes. You learn something new, and instead of feeling like you know more, you feel like you know less, because you can now see how much more there is to understand, how many questions the new knowledge opens rather than closes, how many things you were confident about that turned out to be more complicated than you thought. Expertise genuinely acquired tends to feel like this. The more you know about something, the more clearly you see the edges of what you know and how much lies beyond them. Beginners often feel more confident than experts because beginners do not yet know what they do not know. Experts know the territory well enough to see where it stops and the unknown begins. Socrates took this a step further. He was not just saying that knowledge reveals its own limits, though it does. He was saying something about the examined life versus the unexamined one. He believed that most people lived their lives on the basis of unexamined assumptions, that they had never really interrogated their values or their understanding of what mattered, and that this was a kind of sleep, not comfortable sleep, a sleep that led people to make choices they would not have made if they had actually thought about what they were doing and why. He found this intolerable, not in other people exactly, but in the idea that a life could be lived without ever asking what it was for. What is the thing you are most confident you understand that you have actually examined the least? And what would happen to that confidence if you started asking questions about it the way Socrates asked questions about justice and virtue and the good life? There is a practical consequence of the Socratic Paradox that does not always get mentioned in the philosophical discussions. If knowing that you know nothing is a form of wisdom, then the first step toward knowing something genuinely is to lose the comfortable feeling of already knowing it, and that is an uncomfortable step. People do not generally enjoy having their certainties dismantled. Socrates was aware of this. He described his role as that of a gadfly, an insect that irritates a horse into movement. The city of Athens was the horse. He was trying to keep it from settling into comfortable sleep. Athens eventually killed him for it. He was convicted of impiety and corrupting the youth, and sentenced to death. He accepted the sentence, rather than renounce his practice of questioning, which tells you something about how seriously he took the examined life. More seriously, it turns out, than life itself. The lesson most people take from this is something about the cost of truth-telling, or the danger of challenging power. But there is a quieter lesson underneath it. The discomfort that Socratic questioning produces is not incidental. It is the point. The discomfort is the gap between what you thought you knew and what you actually know being made visible. And visible gaps are the only kind you can do anything about. If you always feel like you already understand the things that matter to you, you will never examine them. And if you never examine them, you are living on borrowed assumptions, ideas that were handed to you by your culture, your family, your circumstances, that you have never tested against your own thinking and experience. Whether those assumptions are good ones or not, you will not know. And you will not know that you do not know, which, according to Socrates, is the worst kind of ignorance. What would it mean to genuinely not know something you currently feel certain about? Not as a philosophical exercise, but as a real experience of your certainty softening and the question underneath it becoming visible. Would that feel like loss or like something opening? The value paradox. Water keeps you alive. Without it, you die within days. Every cell in your body depends on it. Every biological process that makes you a living thing rather than an inert collection of atoms requires water. You need it more than you need almost anything else that exists. A diamond keeps you alive in no sense whatsoever. You can go your entire life without ever touching one, and lose nothing of biological significance. Diamonds are carbon atoms arranged in a particular lattice structure. They are hard and they sparkle. That is essentially everything a diamond does. And yet, diamonds cost thousands of times more than water. A small, clear stone that does nothing for your survival commands a price that would supply a village with clean water for years. A substance without which you cannot survive for more than a few days is available for almost nothing, often for free from a tap. Economists call this the diamond water paradox, or the paradox of value, and it puzzled thinkers for centuries before anyone worked out a satisfying explanation. Adam Smith noticed it in the 18th century and struggled with it. He distinguished between value in use, how useful something is, and value in exchange, what you can trade it for. Water has enormous value in use and almost no value in exchange. Diamonds have almost no value in use and enormous value in exchange. The two kinds of value seem to have no consistent relationship with each other. The resolution that emerged in the late 19th century is marginal utility. What determines the price of something is not its total usefulness, but the usefulness of one more unit of it, given how much of it you already have. Water is so abundant in most contexts that the next glass of it adds very little to your life. You already have enough to drink, to wash, to cook. One more glass matters very little. Diamonds are scarce, so one more diamond adds significantly to what you have, which in practice means what you can signal, display, and trade. Price in this framework is not about what something is worth in the abstract. It is about what one more of it is worth to you right now, given everything you already have. And that marginal value depends entirely on scarcity and abundance, rather than on any intrinsic quality of the thing itself. This is a clean and useful explanation, but it does not fully dissolve the strangeness at the center of the paradox, which is that human beings are capable of valuing things in ways that bear almost no relationship to their actual contribution to human flourishing. A diamond engagement ring costs, on average, several $1,000s in many Western cultures, a sum that would meaningfully change the lives of families in parts of the world where water, food, and medicine are not reliably available. The ring does nothing. It signals commitment, which is valuable, but the ring itself is not doing the work. The commitment is doing the work. The ring is a token of the commitment, and the specific price of the token is determined by a marketing campaign that began in the 1930s, when De Beers a diamond company, introduced the slogan, "A diamond is forever," and successfully convinced an entire culture that a man's love was properly measured in carats. The strangeness of the value paradox is not just that water is underpriced relative to diamonds. It is that human value systems in general are deeply shaped by forces that have nothing to do with what things actually contribute to well-being. Status, scarcity, social signaling, cultural tradition, marketing, aesthetic pleasure, the desire to participate in shared rituals, all of these influence what people will pay for things, and none of them track biological usefulness in any consistent way. Some things we value highly because they are beautiful, even though beauty does not keep us alive. Some things we value because they are rare, even when the rarity is artificial. Some things we value because other people value them, in a circular process, where the value is constituted by the valuing rather than by any property of the thing itself. Some things we value because we were told to, by culture, by advertising, by social expectations we absorbed before we were old enough to question them. And some things of enormous genuine value we barely notice because they are everywhere, not just water, clean air, the stability of the legal system that allows commerce to function, the accumulated knowledge of centuries stored in libraries and online, available for almost nothing, the social trust that makes it possible to interact with strangers without assuming they will harm you. These things are so pervasive that their absence is almost unimaginable from inside a context where they exist, which means their value to individuals within that context approaches zero at the margin, even though their value to the civilization as a whole is incalculable. The paradox of value, taken seriously, suggests that what you spend your attention and resources on is not a reliable guide to what actually matters to you, and that what actually matters to you is not a reliable guide to what would most improve your life, and that what would most improve your life is not reliably visible to you from inside a culture that shapes your sense of value in ways you did not choose and have probably not examined. Water or diamonds? The choice seems obvious until you look at how most people actually spend their money, their time, and their attention, and then it becomes less clear which one they have decided to value. What would change about how you spend the next year if you recalibrated your values around what actually contributes to your flourishing rather than around what your culture has told you is worth having? And would the result feel like deprivation or like relief? There is a version of the value paradox that operates at the level of time rather than money, and it might be more revealing than the diamond water version because time is the one resource that cannot be replenished. People in wealthy countries often spend money to save time. They pay for conveniences, services, and technologies that free up hours in the week. And then they spend those freed up hours on activities that, when examined honestly, do not seem to provide as much genuine satisfaction as the activities they gave up to earn the money to pay for the conveniences. The cycle is self-sustaining, but its direction is not obviously toward anything that matters. Meanwhile, the things that research on human well-being most consistently identifies as contributing to life satisfaction, close relationships, meaningful work, time in nature, physical health, a sense of purpose, these are either free or very cheap or available to most people in wealthy countries who nonetheless consistently report feeling short of them. The value paradox at the level of time is that we spend what we cannot replace on acquiring what we do not need and underinvest in what actually makes the difference, partly because the things that make the difference do not come with price tags that signal their value. A conversation with someone you love is free, a diamond is not, and yet it is easier to know how much you want the diamond, because the price is written on the tag. What is the most valuable thing in your life that has no price? And do you treat it like it is valuable, or do you treat it like it is free? Meno's Paradox. Meno was a wealthy young man from Thessaly who came to Athens and fell into conversation with Socrates. He wanted to discuss virtue, specifically whether virtue could be taught. But before long, Socrates steered the conversation toward a more basic question. What is virtue exactly? Not examples of it, not instances where someone displayed it, but the thing itself, the essential nature of it, the definition that would apply in every case. Meno tried several times to answer. Each attempt Socrates dismantled with questions, and eventually Meno got frustrated and asked something that cut the conversation off at the root. How can you search for something if you do not know what it is? If you do not know what virtue is, you will not recognize it when you find it. And if you already know what it is, there is nothing to search for. Either way, inquiry seems impossible. Socrates called this the paradox of inquiry, and it is one of the oldest and strangest puzzles in the history of thinking. The shape of the problem is clean. To find something, you need to know what you are looking for. But if you know what you are looking for, you have already found it, at least in some sense. And if you do not know what you are looking for, you cannot recognize it when it appears. So genuine discovery, real learning of something genuinely new, seems to be impossible in principle. And yet people clearly do learn things. People discover ideas they did not have before. Scientists find things they were not looking for. Children learn concepts that were not part of their experience. Learning happens, so something about the paradox must be wrong. But finding exactly what is wrong is where things get interesting. Socrates had a response, which was one of the most unusual ideas he ever put forward. He suggested that learning is actually a form of remembering. The soul, he believed, existed before birth and had knowledge of all things. When we seem to be learning something new, we are actually recollecting what we already knew but forgot when we entered the body. Education is not putting knowledge into someone who lacks it. It is drawing out knowledge that was already there. He demonstrated this with a striking experiment. He took an uneducated slave boy who had never studied geometry and asked him a series of questions about a geometric problem, doubling the area of a square. Without teaching the boy anything directly, only by asking questions, Socrates guided him to the correct answer. The boy worked it out himself through questioning. Socrates pointed to this as evidence that the boy had not learned the geometry, he had remembered it. Most modern readers find the theory of recollection unconvincing as a literal account of how the mind works. The soul, existing before birth and carrying geometric knowledge from a previous existence, is not a framework most people operate with. But the underlying observation Socrates was responding to is genuine and interesting. When you seem to learn something new, you are often recognizing something, fitting a new piece into a structure that was already partially there, having an experience of sudden clarity that feels like recognition rather than acquisition. When you understand a mathematical proof for the first time, you do not feel like information is being deposited into you. You feel like something is clicking into place, like you are seeing something that was always there but not yet visible. The experience of comprehension has a quality of recognition to it that is different from mere information transfer. Cognitive scientists have explored this in a different register from Socrates, but with related findings. Learning new things does not happen in a vacuum. You need prior knowledge structures, what researchers call schemas, into which new information can be integrated. Without existing schemas, new information does not stick. A page of advanced mathematics means nothing to someone who has not yet learned the prerequisite concepts. The new knowledge can only be grasped by connecting it to something already understood. This means that all learning is, in some sense, an extension of what you already know. You cannot start from complete ignorance and acquire understanding. You can only move from partial understanding to fuller understanding, from one configuration of what you already know to a more complete configuration. Whether this is what Socrates meant by recollection is debatable, but it suggests that his intuition about the continuity of knowledge, about learning as a process of recognition rather than pure acquisition, was tracking something real about how minds work. Meno's paradox also applies to scientific discovery in a way that philosophers of science have found interesting. How do scientists know what to look for? How did anyone know to look for electromagnetic waves, or for the structure of DNA, or for the Higgs boson? To design an experiment to find something, you need some idea of what you are trying to find. But that idea is itself a form of partial knowledge. The discovery happens when the partial knowledge becomes fuller, when the thing you were somewhat looking for becomes clearly visible. And sometimes discoveries happen sideways, when you were looking for one thing and found something else. Penicillin was discovered because Alexander Fleming noticed something unusual happening in a culture he was not specifically studying for that purpose. X-rays were discovered while Röntgen was experimenting with cathode rays. The discovery was possible because the discoverer recognized something unexpected as significant, which required enough prior knowledge to see it as anomalous and enough openness to follow it rather than dismiss it. Which brings the paradox back around. You need to know enough to recognize what you find, but you cannot know in advance exactly what you will find. Discovery requires a specific combination of prior knowledge and genuine openness, enough structure to recognize significance, and enough space to be surprised. What is it that you are searching for that you cannot yet fully describe? And if you found it, would you know? There is a personal version of Meno's paradox that has nothing to do with geometry or philosophy, and everything to do with how people navigate the larger questions of their lives. What do you want? What kind of person do you want to become? What matters to you most? These feel like questions you should be able to answer. They are about you, after all. But most people find, when they actually try to answer them carefully rather than reflexively, that they do not know as clearly as they thought they did. The things they were certain they wanted turn out, on examination, to be things they absorbed from their environment, rather than things they arrived at through genuine reflection. The kind of person they want to become is often an image borrowed from someone else, rather than a vision they actually constructed. And here the paradox bites hard. To know what you want, you need to know who you are. To know who you are, you need to have examined your own values and desires. But to examine them honestly, you need to know what you are looking for in yourself, which requires already having some of the self-knowledge you are trying to acquire. People navigate this mostly by living rather than by solving it. You try things, you notice what resonates and what does not. You make choices and observe how they feel afterward. You accumulate experiences that gradually sharpen the picture of what you actually value, as opposed to what you thought you valued. The knowledge builds through doing rather than through pure reflection, which is perhaps what Socrates was getting at with the slave boy and the geometry. Not that the knowledge was literally there from birth, but that it can only be drawn out through engagement, through questions, through the friction of actually working the problem. Knowledge of important things does not come from passive reception. It comes from the activity of seeking, which requires some direction, which requires some prior shape of what you are looking for, which is itself a form of partial knowing. Meno wanted to know whether virtue could be taught. Socrates turned it into a question about whether anything can be learned. And the answer that kept not quite resolving itself was yes, but only if you are already somehow partly there. What you are partly there with, right now, tonight, in whatever it is you are searching for, without having fully named it yet, is the beginning of the answer you have not yet found. The Toxin Puzzle. A billionaire walks up to you with an unusual offer. By midnight tonight, she says, form a genuine intention to drink a mildly unpleasant but completely harmless toxin tomorrow afternoon. Not drink it, just intend to drink it, sincerely and genuinely, before you go to sleep. If you manage to form that intention tonight, she will deposit $1 million into your account first thing tomorrow morning, before you even wake up. The catch is this: you do not have to actually drink the toxin. The money will already be in your account by the time the afternoon arrives. Nothing stops you from just not drinking it. There is no penalty for changing your mind after you wake up to find yourself a millionaire. She only requires the genuine intention formed tonight. Can you do it? At first, this seems almost insultingly easy. You want $1 million. You will form the intention. Done. But think more carefully about what it means to genuinely intend to do something. Intention is not the same as deciding to do something. An intention to do X tomorrow requires believing that you will actually do X tomorrow, that you have a reason to do X tomorrow, and that you plan to do X tomorrow for that reason. If you know right now that you have no reason to drink the toxin tomorrow morning because the money will already be in your account and drinking it will do nothing for you, then what is the basis of your intention? What are you intending toward? You can decide to intend to drink the toxin. You can resolve to do it. You can even say the words out loud. But genuine intention, the kind that philosophers mean when they distinguish intending from merely saying, requires a real motivating reason, a reason that will still be operative when the time comes. And by the time the toxin moment arrives, you will have no reason. The money is already yours. Drinking the mild toxin gains you nothing and causes you mild discomfort. A rational person in that position would not drink it. And if you know right now that rational, you tomorrow will not drink it, then what exactly are you intending tonight? Philosopher Gregory Kafka introduced this puzzle in 1983, and it has been unsettling decision theorists ever since. What it exposes is something strange about the relationship between intention and reason. We tend to think of intending as something you can just do, a mental act you can perform by deciding to. But genuine intention seems to require genuine reasons, and reasons are not always available just because you want them to be. This connects to something real about how commitments work in practice. When you make a promise, you are not just stating a prediction about your future behavior. You are creating a reason for future behavior, a reason that did not exist before the promise, and that is supposed to persist even when circumstances change and following through becomes costly or inconvenient. The promise is supposed to bind you. To be a promise in the full sense, it has to actually bind you, which means it has to give you a genuine reason to act when the time comes. The Toxin Puzzle exposes the limit of voluntary intention formation. You can decide to drink the toxin, you can commit to it. But committing to it tomorrow, when there is no reason to drink it, requires a kind of self-binding that is not obviously available through pure decision. The intention needs a reason to stay alive overnight, and the money being deposited in the morning destroys the reason before it can do its work. Kafka himself thought the puzzle revealed something interesting about rational agency. Standard theories of rational decision-making assume that agents act on reasons, that reasons generate intentions, and that intentions generate actions. The Toxin Puzzle creates a situation where having the right intention is itself the thing you are being rewarded for, not having the right reason to act. And the reward structure makes it impossible to form the right intention, because knowing about the reward structure destroys the conditions under which the intention would be genuine. Some people respond to this by saying they would just decide to drink the toxin and follow through regardless, treating it as a matter of integrity rather than calculation. If you are someone who does what you say you will do, you drink the toxin because you said you would, even when it is no longer instrumentally rational. On this view, character and commitment can substitute for ongoing rational reasons. The decision made tonight carries through to tomorrow, not because you still have a reason, but because you are the kind of person who follows through. This is actually a plausible escape from the puzzle, and it connects to something important about what kind of rational agent you want to be. Purely calculating agents, ones who make every decision fresh based on current reasons, cannot form binding commitments, because any commitment can be reconsidered when circumstances change. People with strong dispositions toward following through, even when it is no longer optimal, can make commitments stick. But the puzzle does not fully dissolve even here. The billionaire is asking specifically for a genuine intention, not a commitment or a resolution. And whether following through because you are the kind of person who follows through constitutes a genuine intention to drink the toxin, or whether it constitutes something slightly different, something more like an intention to be consistent with yourself, is a question the puzzle leaves genuinely open. What would you actually do? Not what you think you should do, or what the philosophically sophisticated answer is. What would actually happen, from inside your own psychology, if someone offered you $1 million to genuinely intend to do something mildly unpleasant that you had no reason to do? And does your answer tell you something about what kind of agent you are? The kind whose intentions can survive the removal of their reasons, or the kind who would find themselves, at midnight, genuinely uncertain about whether what they had formed was an intention or just a very convincing performance of one? There is a version of the Toxin Puzzle that shows up in everyday life without any billionaires or unusual offers. Every time you make a plan to do something difficult tomorrow that you have no compelling reason to do today, you are running a smaller version of the same problem. You decide tonight to go for a run tomorrow morning. Tomorrow morning arrives and you are warm in bed, and the run sounds terrible, and the reasons you had last night for wanting to run are still technically present, but feel much less motivating than they did. Did you genuinely intend to run last night, or did you intend to run? Which is a weaker thing that evaporates when the conditions change. People who consistently follow through on plans of this kind are often described as having willpower or discipline. But what they might actually have is a particular relationship to their own intentions, one where the intention itself creates a reason that persists through changing circumstances. They made a plan, and the plan is now a commitment, and breaking commitments costs something internally, even when nothing external forces you to keep them. People who consistently do not follow through on this kind of plan are often described as lacking willpower, but they might more accurately be described as people whose intentions do not generate self-binding reasons, whose plans are predictions about what they will do, rather than commitments that shape what they do. The Toxin Puzzle, in this everyday register, is asking which kind of person you are, not which kind you want to be, which kind you actually are, right now, based on how your intentions actually function in your psychology. And if you are not sure, it is probably because you have not yet been offered $1 million to find out. The Irresistible Force Paradox. What happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object? You have probably heard this question before. It has the quality of a riddle, something you might encounter in a philosophy class or a late-night conversation, and it tends to produce one of two reactions. Either people try to answer it, or they feel like the question is somehow cheating, that it is built wrong in a way that makes answering it impossible. Both reactions are getting at something real. The standard move is to say that the question is self-contradictory and therefore meaningless. If an unstoppable force exists, then by definition, nothing can stop it. But if an immovable object exists, then by definition, nothing can move it. These two definitions are logically incompatible. You cannot have both an unstoppable force and an immovable object in the same universe, because the existence of one rules out the existence of the other. The question assumes a universe where both exist, but no such universe is possible. The question is therefore not a real question. It is a grammatically well-formed string of words that does not refer to any coherent situation. This is a clean and defensible response, but it is also somewhat unsatisfying, because it sidesteps what makes the question interesting. The question is not really asking you to describe a physical event in a hypothetical universe. It is asking something about the nature of omnipotence, absolute power, and absolute resistance, and those concepts do not become boring just because they are mutually exclusive. The question has ancient roots. In Chinese philosophy, there is a story about a merchant selling spears and shields. He claims his spear can pierce any shield, and his shield can stop any spear. A customer asks what happens when his spear meets his shield. The word for this paradox in Chinese, mo dun, which literally means spear shield, is still used today to mean contradiction or conflict. Medieval theologians encountered the same structure in questions about divine omnipotence. Can God create a rock so heavy he cannot lift it? Can God do something that is logically impossible? Can God make a square circle? These questions all have the same form as the Irresistible Force Paradox, and they all run into the same wall. If something is logically impossible, it is not a limitation on power to be unable to do it. Square circles are not things that powerful beings fail to create. They are not things at all. The category of impossible things does not contain objects that slip through even the most powerful fingers. It contains nothing, because impossibilities are not objects. Most philosophers who have thought carefully about divine omnipotence have concluded that omnipotence means the ability to do anything that is logically possible, not anything that can be grammatically described. God can create any coherent object in any coherent situation. God cannot make square circles, not because God lacks power, but because square circles are not things. The limitation is in the concept, not in the power. Apply this to the Irresistible Force Paradox, and it dissolves the same way. An unstoppable force and an immovable object cannot coexist because they are definitionally incompatible. Asking what happens when they meet is asking what happens in a logically impossible situation. And logically impossible situations do not generate answers because they do not exist. But here is what the dissolution leaves behind. Even if the specific scenario is incoherent, the underlying question it is gesturing at is real. What happens when two things that cannot coexist are nevertheless brought into contact? Not in physics, where this does not happen, but in human life, where it happens constantly. Two people in a relationship who both need to be right. Two institutions with incompatible mandates that have jurisdiction over the same situation. Two deeply held values that point in opposite directions when applied to the same specific case. Two aspects of a person's identity that are in genuine tension with each other. These are real irresistible force meets immovable object situations, not in the physical sense but in the practical sense. And they do not dissolve when you note that the two things cannot logically coexist. They demand resolution anyway. When values collide in ways that seem irresolvable, what actually happens is not nothing. Something happens. Something gives. Not necessarily cleanly, not necessarily in a way that satisfies either side, but the situation does not remain suspended in logical impossibility. Life is not a logic textbook. It generates resolutions to impossible situations by making one side give way, by changing what the situation means, by finding a path that the abstract formulation did not anticipate. The Irresistible Force Paradox, applied to real conflicts, teaches something the logical dissolution misses. Not everything that seems irresolvable is actually so. Sometimes the paradox is a failure of imagination about how the situation might develop. Sometimes it is a sign that the categories being used, the definitions of what counts as unstoppable or immovable, need to be revised in light of what actually happens when they encounter each other. And sometimes one of them simply was not as unstoppable or as immovable as it seemed before the meeting. What is the immovable object in your life that you have treated as permanent? And have you ever asked whether it might actually move, if the right force encountered it? There is a version of this paradox that shows up in physics itself, not in the form of the classical riddle, but in the actual behavior of matter at extreme conditions. When a neutron star collapses under its own gravity, the degeneracy pressure of neutrons, the quantum mechanical force that prevents them from being compressed further, acts like an immovable object against the inward force of gravity. For neutron stars below a certain mass, the immovable object wins. The star stabilizes at a dense but finite size. But for stars above a certain mass, the Tolman-Oppenheimer-Volkoff limit, gravity wins. The neutron degeneracy pressure is not immovable enough. The star collapses into a black hole where space-time curvature becomes so extreme that even light cannot escape. The unstoppable force of gravity has crushed what seemed like an immovable resistance into a singularity. What this shows is that in the physical universe, the immovable object is never truly immovable, and the unstoppable force is never truly unstoppable. They are always descriptions of relative strengths. The neutron degeneracy pressure stops gravity in some contexts and does not in others. Gravity overcomes it at sufficient mass, but not below that threshold. The words unstoppable and immovable are always approximately true, always dependent on the specific conditions, always subject to being overturned by a more extreme version of what they were resisting, which maps onto the human situation quite precisely. The things that feel immovable in your life, the beliefs, the relationships, the habits, the self-images that seem fixed and foundational, are almost always approximately immovable rather than absolutely so. They resist most forces. They do not resist all of them. And the things that feel unstoppable, grief, addiction, the momentum of long-established patterns, the pull of certain desires, are almost always approximately unstoppable rather than absolutely so. They overcome most resistance. They do not overcome all of it. The Irresistible Force Paradox resolves not in logic, but in time. Given enough of it, and the right conditions, the force meets the object, and one of them turns out to have been slightly less than advertised. Which one gives way first is sometimes the most important question in a person's life, and the answer is rarely obvious in advance. The Ship of Theseus. There is a ship in a harbor in ancient Athens, famous, historic, preserved for the citizens to see. Over the years, the wood begins to rot, and so the planks are replaced, one by one, a plank here, a beam there. The process is slow and careful, and at every stage the ship still looks the same, and functions the same, and sits in the same place. Eventually, every single piece of the original ship has been replaced. Not all at once, one piece at a time, over many decades. Is it still the same ship? Most people feel the pull of yes. The ship was always there. The maintenance was continuous. There was never a moment where it stopped being the ship and started being something else. The identity persisted through all the replacements. But now someone has been quietly collecting all the old planks as they were removed, storing them carefully. Years later, they reassemble those original planks into a ship. Same design, all original material. Every piece of wood that was there at the beginning is now in this second vessel. Which one is the real Ship of Theseus? The first ship has continuity. The second ship has the original matter. Both claims feel legitimate. Both feel incomplete. And the question does not resolve neatly because it is not really a question about ships. It is a question about what makes something the same thing over time, which turns out to be one of the harder questions in philosophy. There are roughly 3 ways to approach identity through change. You can say identity depends on physical continuity, on the matter the thing is made of. On this view, the second ship, assembled from all the original wood, has the better claim. You can say identity depends on functional or formal continuity, on the shape, the design, the role something plays. On this view, the first ship wins because it remained recognizably itself throughout. Or you can say identity is a conventional matter, a human decision about what counts as the same thing, useful for practical purposes, but not tracking any deep metaphysical fact. On this view, whichever ship the Athenians decide to call the Ship of Theseus is the Ship of Theseus, because that is all identity is. Thomas Hobbes was one of the first philosophers to formalize this thought experiment, though the underlying puzzle goes back to ancient Greece. He used it to argue that identity over time is fundamentally a matter of convention rather than fact. We decide what counts as the same thing based on what is useful for our purposes. But the puzzle is harder to dismiss when you move from ships to persons. Your body replaces most of its cells over years. The atoms that made up your body as a child are mostly gone. The specific configuration of neurons that encoded your earliest memories is not the same configuration that holds your memories now. The beliefs you held at age 10, the things that frightened you, the things you cared about, the person you thought you were, share varying degrees of continuity with who you are tonight. Some things persisted, many things changed. Are you the same person you were at 10 years old? Not in every way, obviously. But in some important sense, you probably feel like yes, there is something that connects the child in your earliest memory to the person lying here. Some thread. What is that thread made of? Not atoms, since most of those have been replaced. Not the same neurons firing in the same patterns, since those have changed too. Maybe it is memory, but memory is reconstructive and changes over time, with each recollection altering the trace slightly. Maybe it is psychological continuity, the overlapping chain of experiences and character traits and dispositions that connect each phase of your life to the next. Maybe it is the narrative you have about yourself, the story that connects who you were to who you are. Derek Parfit, the philosopher who thought longest and hardest about personal identity, concluded that the concept of personal identity matters less than we think it does. What matters, he argued, is not whether you are strictly identical to the person you were at 10, but whether there is enough psychological continuity and connectedness to justify the practical attitudes we take toward that person. The sense of responsibility, the concern for their well-being, the feeling of being the same self. But Parfit also made a more disturbing observation. If personal identity is a matter of degree, if there is more or less continuity rather than a simple yes or no, then many of the things we attach to identity become complicated. The you that will be alive in 30 years will be connected to the current you by a long chain of overlapping psychological states. But the connection will be weaker than the connection between you now and you yesterday. In what sense is that future person you? And what does that mean for how you should weigh their interests against your own current desires? We treat our future selves as definitely us, as continuous with who we are now, in a way that justifies sacrifice for future benefit. But the Ship of Theseus suggests that the question of whether the future self is really you might be murkier than the feeling of it being you. At what point in the gradual replacement of your cells, your memories, your beliefs, your personality, does the person stop being you? And is that question even answerable, or does answering it require a precision about identity that the concept simply does not have? There is a version of the Ship of Theseus paradox that applies to organizations, relationships, and institutions in ways that feel less abstract than questions about personal identity, but are driven by exactly the same structure. A company founded 40 years ago by 3 people in a garage. None of the founders still work there. None of the original employees are left. The product is completely different from the original one. The corporate culture has been transformed several times by different leadership regimes. The name and the logo are the same. Is it the same company, or a long-term relationship? 2 people who have been together for 20 years, both of them are fundamentally different people from the ones who first got together. The dynamics between them have evolved. The things they fight about have changed. The reasons they stay together are not the same as the reasons they started. Is it the same relationship, or a political movement? A set of ideas that began in one historical context, spread, evolved, got interpreted and reinterpreted by successive generations, got used to justify things the original thinkers never anticipated. Are the people who use those ideas today part of the same movement as the founders? In each of these cases, the practical stakes of the identity question are real. Corporate law cares about whether the company is the same legal entity, which determines liability and ownership. Relationship counselors sometimes distinguish between whether a relationship has changed versus whether it has ended and something new begun. Historians and political scientists argue about when a movement has transformed into something different versus when it has simply evolved. But none of these practical questions can be answered by discovering the metaphysical truth about identity, because the metaphysical truth about identity, as the Ship of Theseus shows, is that there might not be one. Identity might be a useful organizing concept that humans apply to things for practical purposes, and different applications might be appropriate for different purposes, without any of them being the objectively correct answer to what the thing really is. The ship in the harbor is whatever the Athenians find it useful to call the Ship of Theseus. The company is the same company for the purposes that make the claim of sameness useful, and a different one for the purposes that make discontinuity relevant. You are the same person as the 10-year-old in your memories in the ways that matter, and a different person in the ways that also matter. Both. Not one or the other. Both. And the discomfort of holding that without resolving it is perhaps the most honest relationship you can have with a question that does not have a single correct answer. What is something in your life that you have been treating as the same thing it always was, without asking whether the continuity you assumed is actually still there? The youth effect, the Euthyphro Dilemma. Socrates is on his way to court. He is about to be tried for impiety, which will eventually lead to his death. On the steps of the courthouse, he runs into a man named Euthyphro, who is also there on religious business. Euthyphro is prosecuting his own father for murder, a deeply unusual act for the time and culture. He explains that his father allowed a laborer to die through neglect, and that the gods demand justice, and that he is therefore doing the pious thing. Socrates, being Socrates, starts asking questions. What is piety exactly? Euthyphro gives several answers, each of which Socrates dismantles. And then Socrates asks the question that gave the dialogue its enduring fame. Is something good because the gods command it? Or do the gods command it because it is good? That is the Euthyphro Dilemma, and it is one of the most compressed and devastating questions in the history of moral philosophy. It targets the attempt to ground morality in divine command, in the idea that right and wrong are determined by what God says is right and wrong. And it shows that this idea has a problem at its foundation, no matter which direction you resolve it. If something is good because God commands it, then goodness is purely a function of God's will. God commands kindness, so kindness is good. God could instead have commanded cruelty, and cruelty would then have been good. Morality is whatever God happens to want, with no independent standard against which God's commands could be evaluated. On this view, calling God good is not really saying anything, because good just means whatever God says, and saying God says what God says is not much of a compliment. If, on the other hand, God commands things because they are good, then goodness exists independently of God's commands. There is a moral standard that God recognizes and endorses, a standard that is not created by God, but that God's commands conform to. This preserves the idea that morality is objective and that God's commands track something real. But it also means that morality does not ultimately depend on God. The standard is independent. God is, in effect, pointing to it rather than creating it. Neither option is comfortable for someone who wants to ground morality in divine command. The first makes morality arbitrary. The second makes God morally redundant, and the dilemma seems to offer no third option. Philosophers and theologians have proposed various ways out over the centuries. One approach, associated with Thomas Aquinas and developed extensively in natural law theory, is to say that God's nature is itself the standard. Good is not whatever God arbitrarily wills, but neither is it an independent standard that exists apart from God. Instead, God's nature is essentially and necessarily good, and God's commands flow from that nature. What God commands is good because it expresses what God essentially is, and God cannot will otherwise than God's nature dictates. This is an ingenious response, but critics have pointed out that it only pushes the dilemma back a level. If God's nature is the standard for goodness, then either God's nature is good by definition, which makes the claim tautological, or there is some standard by which God's nature is evaluated as good, in which case that independent standard is back, and the dilemma resurfaces. For many secular thinkers, the Euthyphro Dilemma is decisive evidence against divine command theory as the foundation of morality. If morality cannot be grounded in divine command, without either making it arbitrary or making God unnecessary, then the search for moral foundations needs to look elsewhere. Most modern moral philosophy has done exactly that, grounding ethics in reason, in human well-being, in social contract, in the conditions for rational cooperation, in the nature of persons as ends in themselves. But the dilemma has implications beyond the specific question of divine command theory. Beneath the theological surface is a more general question about the nature of moral authority. Is something right because someone authoritative says it is, whether that authority is God, or a government, or a culture, or a community? Or does rightness exist independently of what anyone says, and do authorities get their legitimacy from tracking that independent rightness? Legal positivists say law is what the legal system says it is, full stop. Natural lawyers say there are moral standards that law must conform to in order to be legitimate law. Political philosophers debate whether democratic majorities create rights or recognize them. These are all versions of the Euthyphro Dilemma applied to different authorities. And personally, the dilemma applies to anyone trying to figure out where their values come from. Did you develop your sense of right and wrong because certain authorities in your life, parents, teachers, culture, religion, told you what was right and wrong? Or did you develop it by recognizing moral truths that existed independently and that you came to understand through reflection and experience? Most people, if they are honest, will say some of both, which raises the question of how to evaluate the inherited parts. How to know which commands from authority track something real and which are arbitrary. Euthyphro was prosecuting his father because he believed the gods required it. He was confident he was doing the pious thing. Socrates was not sure Euthyphro knew what piety was. As it turned out, Euthyphro did not have a clean answer. Most people who are certain they are doing the right thing have not asked themselves the Euthyphro question. Not about God necessarily, about whatever authority they are following. Is it right because that authority says so, or does the authority say so because it is right? And if you cannot tell the difference, how confident should you be? There is a version of the Euthyphro Dilemma that every person who has ever followed a rule without understanding its reason has encountered, even if they never heard of Socrates or Euthyphro. You were told not to do something as a child. Maybe you were given a reason, and maybe you were not. You followed the rule. Over time, the rule became internalized, became part of how you see the world, became something you feel is right, rather than just something you were told. And at some point you probably stopped asking whether the rule was tracking something real, or whether it was an inherited convention that made sense in a different context and might not apply to yours. Most moral intuitions work this way. They feel authoritative, they feel like they are pointing at something real, but their origin is often in something more contingent than they feel, in what your specific culture, family, and historical moment happen to consider normal and good. The Euthyphro question, applied here, asks whether the feeling of authority your moral intuitions carry is evidence that they are tracking something real, or whether the feeling itself is the product of having absorbed those intuitions from authorities who felt the same way about their own inherited intuitions. The dilemma does not answer this. It just makes the question visible, and making it visible is most of what philosophy can do with something this deep. Whether you think morality is discovered or constructed, whether you think there are moral facts independent of human agreement, or whether morality is a human project without a cosmic backstop, the Euthyphro Dilemma is the place where that decision has to be made. And it cannot be made without confronting the fact that neither option is entirely comfortable. What would you be willing to do if a sufficiently authoritative voice told you it was right? And what would no authority be able to make you do, regardless of what it told you? The gap between those two answers is where your actual moral commitments live. The Dichotomy Paradox. You want to leave the room you are lying in right now? Simple enough. You get up, you walk to the door, you leave. But Zeno of Elea, thinking about this around 450 BC, noticed something strange about what that journey actually involves. Before you can reach the door, you have to reach the halfway point between where you are and the door. And before you can reach that halfway point, between you and that halfway point, and before you can reach that point, you have to reach the halfway point before it. Every gap you need to cross contains another gap inside it. Every distance contains an infinite number of smaller distances, and you have to complete all of them in order before you can take a single step, which means you can never start. Not just that you can never finish, you cannot even begin, because between you and the first step is another half step, and before that a quarter step, and before that an eighth step, and the regress goes back toward you indefinitely. Taking any step at all requires completing an infinite number of tasks first. And yet you get up, you walk to the door, you leave. Motion happens. People travel across rooms and across continents and back again. Whatever Zeno's argument is doing, it is not accurately describing what actually occurs when physical objects move through space. So what is it doing? The mathematical answer, which has been largely settled since the development of calculus, is that an infinite series of quantities can have a finite sum. Half plus a quarter plus an eighth plus a 16th, going on forever, adds up to 1. The infinite number of divisions does not produce an infinite distance. It produces the same finite distance, divided into smaller and smaller pieces. So crossing a room requires completing infinitely many sub-journeys, but those sub-journeys add up to the finite distance of the room. And crossing a finite distance takes a finite time. This is clean, it is mathematically sound, but it leaves a nagging philosophical residue that the mathematics alone does not wash away. The mathematical resolution tells you that the sum of the infinite series converges to a finite number. What it does not tell you is how a physical object actually completes infinitely many tasks. Completing a task, even a very small one, seems to require some minimum amount of time, and yet if you have to complete literally infinitely many tasks to cross a room, and each task takes some time, however small, then you would need infinite time. Except you do not need infinite time, you need about 5 seconds. One response is that the tasks at the end of the series take correspondingly tiny amounts of time, approaching zero as the distances approach zero, and the total time converges to a finite sum just as the distances do. This is mathematically correct, but the philosophical question underneath it is whether time actually passes in those tiny increments, or whether at some scale of smallness the whole framework of tasks and distances breaks down and something else is happening. Modern physics suggests that space and time might indeed be discrete at the Planck scale, rather than infinitely divisible. If space is not infinitely divisible, then there is no actual infinite sequence of divisions in crossing a room. There is a very large but finite number of Planck-length steps. The dichotomy paradox dissolves, not because the infinite series converges, but because there is no genuine infinite series. Space just runs out of divisions before you reach infinity. But we do not know this for certain. Whether space is discrete or continuous at the fundamental level is still an open question in physics, and the paradox, in its full form, only applies if space is genuinely continuous, if you really can keep dividing any distance in half indefinitely. Zeno thought the paradox proved that motion was an illusion. His teacher Epimenides held that reality was one, undivided, unchanging, and that the world of appearances, with its multiplicity and motion and change, was fundamentally deceptive. Zeno was trying to defend this view by showing that ordinary concepts of motion lead to absurdity. Most people find this conclusion impossible to accept. The room is real, the door is real, motion obviously happens, but Zeno's argument does not obviously fail. Each step of it seems valid, and the tension between the apparent validity of the argument and the obvious reality of motion has kept philosophers and mathematicians working on it for 2,500 years. What it points at, beneath the mathematical machinery, is something about whether our ordinary concepts of space, time, and motion really make sense at the level of analysis Zeno was applying. We are comfortable with motion as something we experience. We are much less comfortable with motion as something we try to reconstruct from infinite divisibility. Maybe motion is fundamental and not reducible to anything simpler. Maybe asking how an object crosses the infinite divisions of a continuous space is asking the wrong question. Maybe the framework of infinitely divisible space itself is where the problem originates. Or maybe Zeno found a genuine crack in the foundations and we have been papering over it with convergent series for 2,000 years without actually fixing it. There is a version of this that applies to decisions rather than distances. Before you can commit to something difficult, you feel like you need to consider all the relevant factors. But before you can do that, you need to figure out what counts as relevant. And before that, you need a framework for evaluating relevance. And before that, you need prior values to ground the framework. The regress extends backward indefinitely, just like the half steps toward the door. People who overthink decisions are experiencing the Dichotomy Paradox applied to choice, and the practical resolution is the same as the mathematical one in a loose sense. At some point, you just move, not because you have resolved the regress, but because life does not wait for it to resolve. You act on whatever framework you have, even if it has not been fully examined, which is what humans do with motion too, every time they cross a room, not because they have resolved Zeno, because they just move. What Zeno was ultimately pointing at is the gap between how we experience the world and how analysis describes it. Experience tells you that crossing a room is trivial. Analysis keeps finding infinite regresses inside it. And somewhere in that gap between the lived and the analyzed is where the paradox lives permanently, refusing to resolve cleanly in either direction. Whether the infinite regress is a feature of space itself or a feature of how our concepts carve up space is still an open question. Mathematicians resolved the infinite sum. Physicists may eventually resolve the discreteness question, but the philosophical question underneath both of them, about what it means to actually complete an infinite task rather than just calculate the sum of one, remains genuinely unsettled. And you cross the room anyway. That is not an answer, but it is something. The Epicurean Paradox. Epicurus, the ancient Greek philosopher who spent his life thinking about pleasure and the good life, also thought carefully about something much darker. He was living in a world with gods who were believed to be powerful, aware, and capable of intervening in human affairs. And he looked at the world as it actually was, full of suffering, disease, cruelty, natural disaster, and the grinding misery of ordinary human existence, and he asked a question that has not stopped being asked in the 2,000 years since. If there is a God who is willing to prevent evil but not able to, then that God is not omnipotent. If there is a God who is able to prevent evil but not willing, then that God is malevolent. If there is a God who is both willing and able to prevent evil, then why does evil exist? And if there is a God who is neither willing nor able to prevent evil, then why call it a God at all? The formulation attributed to Epicurus comes to us second-hand, through the skeptic Sextus Empiricus writing centuries later, so historians are cautious about whether these exact words were his. But the argument itself is ancient and has been stated in various forms by philosophers across many traditions. David Hume gave it a particularly sharp formulation in his dialogues concerning natural religion in the 18th century, and it remains, in the 21st century, one of the most discussed problems in the philosophy of religion. The problem has two forms that are worth keeping distinct. The logical problem of evil asks whether the existence of any evil is logically compatible with the existence of an omnipotent, omniscient, and perfectly good God. Some philosophers have argued that these two facts are simply contradictory, that a world with evil could not have been created by such a God, full stop. Others have argued that this is too strong, that a perfectly good God might have reasons to permit some evil that we cannot see. The evidential problem of evil is weaker and more persistent. It asks not whether any evil is compatible with such a God, but whether the amount and distribution of evil we actually observe is what you would expect to find in a world created by such a God. The suffering of children, natural disasters that kill indiscriminately, diseases that cause prolonged agony with no apparent purpose, predators that have evolved specifically to cause suffering to their prey, the sheer scale and apparent arbitrariness of pain in the living world. Theists have offered various responses over the centuries. The most common is the free will defense. God gave humans genuine freedom, and genuine freedom requires the ability to choose evil as well as good. Much of the suffering in the world is the result of human choices, and a world with genuine freedom is better, even accounting for its evils, than a world of moral puppets. This is a compelling response to moral evil, the suffering caused by human choices. But it does not obviously extend to natural evil, the suffering caused by earthquakes, cancers, viruses, and animal predation, which seem to have nothing to do with human free will. A child born with a painful terminal illness has not suffered because someone chose to harm them. The disease did not require human freedom. Some theists respond that natural evil serves a purpose of soul-making. a world without challenges and suffering would not produce the deep virtues of courage, compassion, and resilience that a world with suffering makes possible. John Hick developed this view at length, arguing that we should think of human life not as a paradise being corrupted, but as a vale of soul-making, a place where moral and spiritual growth happens precisely because it is difficult. Critics find this unconvincing at the scale of actual suffering. The Holocaust as a soul-making exercise. The slow death of a child from cancer as an opportunity for spiritual growth. These formulations strike many people as not just wrong but morally offensive, placing an abstract theological purpose above the concrete reality of specific suffering people. And there is a deeper problem. If suffering serves the purpose of producing virtue, then a God who could achieve the same virtues through less suffering would be better still. But a God who is both omnipotent and perfectly good would surely choose the path that produces the most good with the least unnecessary suffering. The amount of suffering in the world seems vastly in excess of what any soul-making purpose would require. Philosophers who defend the existence of God despite this problem often appeal to what is called the skeptical theist position. We should not expect to be able to understand the full reasons a perfectly good and omnipotent God might have for permitting evil. Our cognitive limitations mean that goods and reasons that are transparent to an omniscient being might be completely invisible to us. The fact that we cannot see a good reason for a particular instance of suffering does not mean there is none. This is intellectually honest about human cognitive limitations, but critics point out that it makes the defense of theism largely unfalsifiable. Any amount of suffering, no matter how apparently pointless and gratuitous, can be attributed to inscrutable divine reasons. A hypothesis that cannot be disconfirmed by any evidence is not doing much philosophical work. The Epicurean Paradox does not prove that God does not exist. What it does is put the burden squarely on anyone who believes in an omnipotent, omniscient, perfectly good God to explain the world as it actually is, not in general terms. Specifically, why this child? Why this disease? Why this earthquake? Why this much of it? Those questions have not been answered in a way that most people, thinking carefully, find fully satisfying. And they keep being asked, which is perhaps the most honest response available to them. What kind of answer would you need to feel like the question had been addressed? And is that kind of answer available anywhere? There is a version of the Epicurean Paradox that does not require belief in God at all. Think about how human institutions work. A government that claims to care about its citizens and has the power to prevent certain suffering, but does not. A corporation with resources to improve conditions for people its operations affect, but that chooses not to. A person who can help someone in need and walks past. The structure of the question is identical. Power plus goodness minus action equals a question about whether the goodness was real. Philosophers call this structural complicity, and it shows up in political philosophy as often as in theology. How much responsibility does a powerful institution bear for suffering it could have prevented? If you could stop a child from drowning at no significant cost, and you choose not to, most people feel you have done something wrong, even though you did not cause the drowning. Now scale that up to institutions with vast resources and the suffering they could reduce but do not. Epicurus himself concluded that the gods simply did not involve themselves in human affairs. They lived in perfect tranquility and cared nothing for us. Not a comforting conclusion, but at least an honest one. What would it mean to take the question seriously, not as a theological puzzle, but as a live question about power and responsibility in the world as it actually is? Zeno's Achilles. Achilles was the fastest runner in Greece. Everyone knew this. He could outrun anyone, outpace any animal, cover ground with a speed that seemed almost inhuman. So when he agreed to race a tortoise and gave it a head start of 10 meters, out of fairness, nobody expected it to be a serious contest. The race begins. Achilles runs toward where the tortoise started. By the time he reaches that spot, the tortoise has moved forward a little. So Achilles runs to where the tortoise is now, but by the time he gets there, the tortoise has moved again. Achilles reaches that point. The tortoise has moved again. Every time Achilles arrives where the tortoise was, the tortoise is somewhere slightly ahead. Zeno of Elea used this to argue that Achilles can never catch the tortoise. Not that it would take a very long time, that it would be logically impossible, because between Achilles and the tortoise there is always a gap, and closing any gap requires first closing half of it, which leaves a smaller gap, which requires closing half of that, and so on, infinitely. The number of steps required is infinite, and Zeno thought you could not complete an infinite number of steps in finite time. We know Achilles catches the tortoise. Every person who has ever run faster than a slow-moving animal has confirmed this experimentally. But Zeno's argument, taken on its own terms, does not obviously fail. Each step of the reasoning seems valid, and yet the conclusion cannot be right. The mathematical resolution that eventually emerged, 2,000 years after Zeno, involves the concept of a convergent infinite series. When the gaps between Achilles and the tortoise get smaller and smaller in a specific way, their sum converges to a finite number. Add up an infinite number of decreasing quantities, and you can get a finite total. So Achilles does complete infinitely many steps, in some sense, but those steps add up to a finite distance and a finite time, and the race ends at a specific real moment when he overtakes the tortoise. This is the standard answer. It is mathematically correct, and it still leaves something uncomfortable for people who think carefully about what completing infinitely many tasks actually means. The mathematician and philosopher Hermann Weyl called this the paradox of the runner, and spent considerable effort thinking about why the mathematical resolution, correct as it is, does not fully dissolve the philosophical unease. His concern was not about the sum of the series, but about the nature of completing tasks. Each of Achilles' steps to close half the remaining gap is a genuine action, a physical event with a beginning and an end. To say he completes infinitely many of these is to say that an infinite number of physical events occur before he catches the tortoise. And there is something strange about a finite interval of time containing infinitely many distinct events. Modern physics complicates this further in an interesting way. If space and time are quantized at the Planck scale, then there is no genuine infinite sequence of halvings. At some level of smallness, the halvings stop because there is no smaller unit of space or time. The race is actually completed in a very large but finite number of steps. Zeno's paradox dissolves not because the series converges, but because the series is not actually infinite in a physical universe with discrete space-time. But again, whether space-time is truly discrete, or whether the Planck scale is just where our current theories fail, is still not known. The question is genuinely open. What Zeno was really pointing at, underneath the racing metaphor, is something about the relationship between mathematical infinity and physical reality. Mathematics can describe infinite processes and assign finite values to them. Whether the physical world actually contains infinite processes, or whether it just appears to, because our mathematical descriptions of it do, is a different question entirely. The race between Achilles and the tortoise is not really a race. It is an argument about whether the continuous seeming world we experience is genuinely continuous, or whether it is discrete at some fundamental level we cannot observe. Achilles catching the tortoise is obvious. What it means at the level of fundamental physics is not. Zeno knew Achilles would catch the tortoise. He could see it as well as anyone. His argument was not meant to deny what is visible, but to reveal something hidden in the structure of motion and continuity that the visible surface does not show. Whether he found a genuine feature of reality or a feature of how mathematical descriptions interact with physical ones, the race is still running 2,500 years later. What does it mean for something to be genuinely continuous, with no smallest unit, no bottom level below which there is nothing further? And is that even possible, or does reality always turn out to have a flaw somewhere? There is a version of Zeno's Achilles that applies to catching up in human endeavors, rather than in foot races, and it has a similar structure to the original, without requiring any mathematics. You are behind someone in a skill, a craft, a career, a relationship, a domain where they have more experience and more development than you. You close some of the gap, but while you were closing it, they were not standing still. They kept moving forward too, so you close more of the gap, and they moved further again. Every time you reach where they were, they are somewhere else. The gap shrinks, but there is always a gap. This is the subjective experience of trying to catch up with someone significantly ahead, and it has the same psychological texture as Zeno's paradox. No matter how much progress you make, the distance remains because the target is moving. And unlike a mathematical series, there is no guarantee that human development gaps converge to zero, because the person ahead might develop faster than you can close the gap. What makes this a version of the paradox rather than just a discouraging fact is the question of whether the pursuit itself has a structure that makes catching up impossible in principle. In some fields it does, at least in the short run. A beginner cannot catch a master in a short enough time frame because mastery takes time that cannot be compressed beyond certain limits. The gap has a flaw, below which further effort in a given period cannot push, but over long enough periods, gaps close, skills plateau, people fall behind. The tortoise, in human development, does not always stay ahead. Whether this should be encouraging or not depends on the specific situation and the specific gap. What the Zeno parallel does is reframe the feeling of never quite catching up not as evidence of personal inadequacy, but as a structural feature of pursuing a moving target. The gap is not evidence that you are failing, it is evidence that you are chasing something real. Whether Achilles eventually catches the tortoise in your particular race, and what happens when he does, is something Zeno's argument leaves open. He was interested in the structure of the pursuit, not its conclusion, and sometimes the structure of the pursuit is the most interesting part. The race, for now, continues. As it always has. The gambler's fallacy. A coin has been flipped 9 times. Every single time it has landed heads. 9 heads in a row. You are about to flip it a 10th time, and you are asked to bet on the outcome. Most people, without thinking too carefully, feel that tails is due. 9 heads in a row is unusual. The coin should be balancing out. The universe has some kind of memory of previous flips, and the tail side has been suppressed and it will reassert itself. Something like this runs in the background of how most people respond to this scenario. But the coin does not know it has landed heads 9 times. Each flip is independent. The probability of tails on the 10th flip is exactly 50%, the same as it was on the first flip, the same as it would be if this were the first time the coin had ever been flipped in the history of the world. Previous outcomes have no causal influence on future outcomes for a fair coin. The coin has no memory. The universe has no obligation to balance things out. This is the gambler's fallacy, and it is one of the most persistent and consequential errors in human reasoning. Persistent because it is built into how our pattern recognition systems work. Consequential because it shows up in contexts with real stakes, at casino tables, in investment decisions, in medical interpretations of statistical data. The fallacy runs in 2 directions, which is part of what makes it interesting. People expect random sequences to balance out in the short run, which makes them think tails is due after a string of heads. This is the classic version, but people also sometimes commit the reverse fallacy, believing that a streak of heads indicates a hot streak, that the coin has somehow become more likely to land heads because it has been doing so. Both errors come from the same source, treating random events as if they have causal relationships with each other when they do not. What drives both versions is the human tendency to see patterns and to assume that patterns have meaning. We evolved in a world where patterns generally did have meaning. The sound of rustling in the bushes followed by a predator attack twice in a row meant something. The fruit on that tree being ripe every year at this time of year meant something. Pattern recognition saved lives. But the same machinery, applied to genuinely random processes like coin flips or roulette wheels, generates false patterns and false beliefs about those patterns. Casinos are designed around this. The boards at roulette tables displaying recent results are not there for player convenience. They are there because players see red coming up 8 times in a row and think black is due and bet accordingly. The casino knows the wheel has no memory. The player's pattern recognition system does not know this at a felt level, even when the player knows it intellectually. The same fallacy appears in sports commentary constantly. A player who has missed several shots in a row is described as due for a basket. A team on a losing streak is described as overdue for a win. Some of this might be correct, if the performance is actually correlated across time because of psychological factors like confidence or fatigue. But most of it is the gambler's fallacy applied to sports, treating independent events as if they are connected by some balancing mechanism. What makes the gambler's fallacy philosophically interesting, rather than just psychologically interesting, is what it reveals about human intuitions regarding probability and fairness. People feel, at a deep level, that random processes should be fair in the short run as well as the long run. A fair coin should land heads about 50% of the time, and people interpret this statistical fact as implying something about how individual flips should go, as if the coin has an obligation to distribute its outcomes evenly across every stretch of flips. but fairness in the probabilistic sense is a long-run property. Over 1 million flips, a fair coin will land heads very close to 500,000 times. Over 10 flips, anything can happen. 9 heads and 1 tails is unusual but not astronomically improbable. And the fact that it has happened gives you no information about what the next flip will do. Psychologist Daniel Kahneman spent decades documenting how systematic the gambler's fallacy is in human judgment, and how resistant it is to correction. Knowing about the fallacy does not automatically protect you from it. You can understand completely that each flip is independent and still feel, in the moment of watching the 9th head land, that tails must be coming. The feeling and the knowledge sit in different places and do not always communicate with each other. This is one of the things that makes probability genuinely hard rather than merely complicated. Understanding probability is not primarily an intellectual achievement. It requires training your intuitions, not just your explicit beliefs, to respond correctly to genuinely random information. And training intuitions takes more than reading about a fallacy. It takes repeated exposure to actually random processes and the experience of being wrong in specific ways, often enough that the wrongness becomes visceral. Most people never get that training. And so the gambler's fallacy runs in the background of enormous numbers of decisions, large and small, in people who would immediately recognize it and reject it if it was shown to them explicitly. What is a belief you hold about what is due to happen in your own life, based on what has been happening recently? And how much of that belief is a pattern your mind found, rather than a pattern that is actually there? There is a version of this fallacy that applies to personal history rather than coin flips, and it is subtler and more consequential than the casino version. After a run of bad luck or difficult circumstances, people often feel that things should get better soon, that the universe owes them an improvement. After a long stretch of good things, people sometimes feel anxious that something bad must be coming to balance it out. Neither of these beliefs is supported by any mechanism in the world. Life is not a coin that balances over time. Good periods are not followed by bad ones on any schedule. Bad periods do not guarantee that relief is imminent. And yet the feeling persists, not just as a casual thought, but as a deep emotional orientation toward the future that shapes decisions and interpretations. Someone who has had a very difficult year might take more risks than is rational because they feel they are due for a good one. Someone who has had several years of success might unconsciously undermine themselves because the success feels unsustainable. The universe has no memory of your previous experiences. Your good years do not put you in debt. Your bad years do not earn you credit. Whatever comes next arrives without knowledge of what came before it for you specifically. The coin does not know, and neither does what is coming next for you. That is not cruelty. It is just how randomness actually works. The interesting number paradox. Consider the number 1. 1 is interesting. It is the first positive integer, the multiplicative identity, the number that leaves everything unchanged when you multiply by it. Interesting. 2 is interesting. First even number, first prime by some definitions, the only even prime, very interesting. 3 is interesting. First odd prime, famous in many mathematical contexts, interesting. Keep going and you will find that every number you examine has some property that makes it interesting. 4 is the first composite number. 5 is the number of Platonic solids. 6 is a perfect number, equal to the sum of its divisors. 7 has claimed a special psychological status across many cultures. 8 is the cube of 2. 9 is the square of 3. Now suppose at some point you reach a number that has no interesting properties. Call it n. What do you know about n? You know it is the smallest number with no interesting properties. But being the smallest number with no interesting properties is itself an interesting property. So n is interesting after all. Contradiction. You cannot have a smallest uninteresting number because identifying it as such makes it interesting. Therefore, there is no smallest uninteresting number. And if there is no smallest uninteresting number, then you cannot have any uninteresting numbers at all, because any sequence of uninteresting numbers would have a smallest member, which would be interesting. All positive integers are interesting. This is the interesting number paradox, and it walks a careful line between being a genuine logical puzzle and being a clever joke. Dismissing it as a joke is probably wrong. Taking it completely seriously as deep mathematics is probably also wrong. But sitting somewhere in the middle, it reveals something genuinely worth thinking about. The concept of interesting is doing all the work here, And interesting is not a mathematical property. It is a psychological and contextual one. Whether a number is interesting depends on who is looking, what they know, and what framework they are using to evaluate. A professional number theorist might find interesting properties in numbers that a casual observer would consider completely unremarkable. A different theorist with different specializations might find the same numbers dull and different ones fascinating. What the paradox is really exposing is the instability of the concept of interesting when applied to a domain as rich as the integers. The set of positive integers is extraordinarily rich in structure. Every number sits in a web of relationships with other numbers, and those relationships generate properties without obvious end. There is always something to say about any number if you look at it from enough angles. Philosopher and logician W.V.O. Quine pointed to paradoxes of self-reference as revealing the limits of informal concepts when they are applied to mathematical objects. Interesting is exactly this kind of concept, informal and context-dependent, and applying it to the integers produces this infinite regress because the integers are complex enough to always generate new interesting relationships. But the paradox does something more than just expose the limits of the concept of interesting. It points at a deeper question about whether mathematics discovers or creates. Every number has properties. Some of those properties are simple and immediately visible, like being prime or composite. Others are complex and buried, like being expressible as the sum of 4 squares in exactly 17 ways using integers up to a certain size. Whether these properties exist independently of anyone noticing them, or whether they only become real properties when someone articulates them, is genuinely contested. If mathematical properties exist independently, then every number has infinitely many of them. And the concept of uninteresting collapses because interest just means noticed or known. An uninteresting number would just be one whose properties no one has happened to articulate yet. If mathematical properties are constructed through articulation, then a number only has the properties that have been defined and proven for it, and in principle there could be numbers with very few known properties. But as mathematics develops, it finds properties of more and more numbers, and the ones with very few known properties tend to be the very large or very specific ones where the tools have not yet been applied. There is something recursive about this that the paradox captures neatly. Trying to find an uninteresting number draws attention to the number, which prompts investigation, which reveals properties, which makes it interesting. The very act of searching for uninteresting numbers produces interesting ones. The search is self-defeating. Mathematics has this quality more broadly. The things that look featureless at one level of analysis always seem to reveal structure when the analysis is pushed further. The integers that look uninteresting from one angle look fascinating from another. Whether this is a feature of the integers themselves or a feature of how mathematics extends itself is another version of the same question. What would it mean for a number to be genuinely uninteresting? Not just unexamined, but truly featureless, truly without properties worth noticing. And is that even a coherent concept, or does the moment you ask the question about a specific number, the question itself make it interesting? There is a version of the interesting number paradox that applies to people rather than integers, and it is harder to dismiss as a clever joke. Every person, when examined carefully enough, turns out to have properties that make them interesting. Not in the surface sense of being entertaining or accomplished, but in the deeper sense of having a specific configuration of experiences, relationships, capacities, and contradictions that cannot be reduced to a simple description. The person who seems most unremarkable from the outside contains, when approached with genuine attention, a complexity that defies simple summary. This is not a sentimental claim. It follows from the same structure as the number paradox. Any person is the product of an enormous number of causal factors, biological and biographical and social. And those factors generate properties, behavioral tendencies, emotional patterns, ways of relating to the world that can be examined from many different angles. The more carefully you look, the more you find. What makes people seem uninteresting is usually insufficient examination rather than actual absence of properties. The person who seems generic is often generic only from the outside, from a distance, without the specific knowledge that would make their particular configuration visible. And just as identifying a number as the smallest uninteresting one makes it interesting, paying genuine attention to a person who seemed uninteresting tends to reveal the properties that make them not uninteresting after all. Whether that is philosophically significant or just an encouraging observation about human depth is something the paradox leaves open, but the structure is the same. The search for the uninteresting, whether in numbers or in people, tends to be self-defeating. What would you find if you examine someone you have considered unremarkable with the same attention a mathematician brings to a number? And what would that kind of looking require of you? The Braess Paradox. Stuttgart, 1969. Traffic in the city is bad enough that the authorities decide to build a new road, a new route connecting two points that previously had no direct link. More roads means more options for drivers. More options means better flow, less congestion. The logic seems airtight. After the new road opens, traffic gets worse. Not marginally worse, measurably, consistently, significantly worse. The extra road had made the congestion more severe, not less. Dietrich Braess, a mathematician, had predicted exactly this. Not for Stuttgart specifically, but as a general property of certain kinds of networks. He showed mathematically that adding capacity to a network can reduce its overall performance, and that removing a road from a network can sometimes make traffic flow better for everyone. When a real-world test came in New York City in 1990, a stretch of 42nd Street was closed to cars as part of Earth Day events. Traffic engineers braced for chaos. Instead, traffic around the closed street actually improved. When the street reopened, the improvement went away. A city with one fewer road had moved faster. The reason comes down to the difference between individual rational behavior and collective optimal behavior. When drivers are free to choose their routes, each driver picks the route that is best for them given current conditions. But what is best for each individual driver is not necessarily what is best for all the drivers collectively. When a new road opens, drivers who previously took longer routes now take the shortcut. The shortcut gets congested. The congestion spreads. Everyone is slightly worse off, including the drivers who switched to the shortcut and the ones who did not. Game theorists call the outcome that arises from individual rational behavior the Nash equilibrium, after mathematician John Nash. And in certain network configurations, the Nash equilibrium is worse than what could be achieved if everyone coordinated their behavior. Each person is doing the locally rational thing. The collectively rational outcome is something different, something no individual can bring about on their own. This is not unique to traffic. Braess's paradox is a specific case of a more general phenomenon in economics, ecology, and engineering where adding resources or capacity to a system makes it perform worse because of how agents respond to the new capacity. Computer networks show the same effect. Adding bandwidth to certain parts of a network can slow overall data transmission because routing algorithms respond to the new capacity in ways that create new bottlenecks. The algorithms are doing what they are designed to do, finding optimal paths for individual packets, but the collective result is suboptimal. Ecological systems show it too. Adding a predator to an ecosystem can sometimes increase the population of prey species by disrupting the behavior of a different predator. Adding a species can reduce biodiversity. The system responds to additions in ways that are not obvious from inspecting only the added element. What makes the Braess Paradox philosophically interesting, rather than just technically interesting, is what it implies about the relationship between local rationality and global outcomes. We tend to assume that systems built from individually rational components will produce collectively rational results, or at least will not be made worse by adding more of something good. More roads are good. More bandwidth is good. More options are good. But Braess shows that this assumption fails in certain structural conditions. The system has a shape, a topology, and that topology determines whether adding good things makes things better or worse. Getting the topology right matters more in those cases than adding more of the thing you think is beneficial. And you cannot usually see the topology from inside the system. Drivers cannot see the whole road network as a structure whose properties change when new routes are added. They see their own route and the traffic in front of them. The collective effect of their individually rational choices is invisible to each of them. This is a more general problem than just roads. Most people cannot see the systems they are embedded in well enough to predict how their individually rational behavior affects collective outcomes. Tax policy, environmental regulation, public health, financial markets, social media dynamics, All of these are systems where individual rational behavior aggregates in ways that produce collective outcomes nobody intended, and that might be worse than what a more coordinated approach would produce. The challenge is that coordination is hard, and trust is scarce. Even if you could convince everyone that a different equilibrium would be better for all of them, getting there requires everyone to change behavior simultaneously, which requires everyone to trust that others will change too, which requires a level of coordination that individual rational behavior specifically does not provide. Braess's road sits in the middle of the network, connecting everything to everything, making travel individually easier and collectively worse. And most days, the drivers on it do not know it is there, or what it is doing to them. What systems are you embedded in where your individually rational choices might be contributing to a collective outcome that is worse than what coordination could produce? And would you change your behavior if you could see the topology clearly enough to know? There is a version of the Braess Paradox that applies to personal development rather than traffic networks, and it shows up in recognizable form in the experience of trying to improve your own life by adding more to it. More commitments, more goals, more tools, more frameworks, more productivity systems. Each addition seems individually beneficial. Each new commitment is something you genuinely want to do. Each new tool addresses a real need. But at some point, the system of your own life develops a topology where adding more things makes the whole thing work less well. The new commitments create coordination costs with existing ones. The new tools require time to maintain. The new goals compete with each other for the same finite resource of attention. What was individually good becomes collectively worse. The network of your life, like the road network of Stuttgart, degrades when you add capacity to it in the wrong places. The Braess solution in traffic is to remove the road that is causing the problem. The counterintuitive fix for a congested system is sometimes to take something away. Not to add better roads, but to close the one that is misdirecting traffic. Applied personally, the Braess solution looks like simplification. Not adding better tools, but removing the ones creating coordination overhead. Not taking on more goals, but identifying which ones are interfering with each other. The difficulty is the same as in traffic. You cannot see your own topology clearly enough to know which road to close. Each commitment seems individually worth keeping. The collective dysfunction is visible, but its source is not. What would you need to remove from your life to make the whole thing flow better? And is it obvious which road that is, or invisible precisely because it seems like it should be helping? The Epimenides Paradox. Epimenides was a Cretan, a philosopher, a poet, possibly a religious figure, living somewhere around the 6th century BC. And according to a line that has echoed through 2,500 years of logic, he said something about his own people that created a problem nobody has fully resolved since. All Cretans are liars. He was a Cretan, so if he was telling the truth, then all Cretans are liars, which means he is a liar, which means what he said was false, which means not all Cretans are liars, which means he could have been telling the truth, and around it goes. This looks like the liar paradox, but it is subtler than it first appears, and the differences between them are worth sitting with. The strict liar paradox, the sentence "this statement is false," is designed to be perfectly self-undermining. There is no way out. If it is true, it is false. If it is false, it is true. No version of the truth value of the sentence is stable. The paradox is airtight. The Epimenides paradox has more room in it, and that room has generated centuries of interesting logical work. Start with the simple observation that the paradox only bites if you assume that Epimenides is telling the truth, and that the statement applies to him. If Epimenides is lying, then not all Cretans are liars. But that does not mean Epimenides is telling the truth. He could be one of the lying Cretans, saying something false, namely that all Cretans lie, when in fact only some of them do, including him. Under this interpretation, there is no paradox at all. Epimenides is just a liar, making a sweeping false claim about his compatriots. The bite comes when you try to determine whether what he said could possibly be true. If it were true, he would be lying, so it could not be true, so it must be false. No contradiction so far. A false statement from a liar is perfectly coherent, but which part is false? Is it false because Epimenides himself is not a liar? Or is it false because only some Cretans are liars, including Epimenides, making his statement an overstatement? The paradox proper emerges when you add the assumption that Epimenides himself is a Cretan who always lies, never tells the truth. Under that assumption, the statement cannot be false in the ordinary sense, because if it were simply false, that all Cretans lie, then Epimenides might be one of the honest ones, which contradicts the assumption. So the statement is false in a specific way, because Epimenides, as a confirmed liar, made it, and everything he says is false, including this. But if everything he says is false, and he says all Cretans are liars, then it is false that all Cretans are liars, which means some Cretans are honest, which could mean Epimenides himself is honest, which contradicts the assumption that he always lies. The paradox closes. What makes this philosophically significant beyond the cleverness is what it revealed to logicians in the 20th century about the dangers of self-reference and of systems that can talk about themselves. Bertrand Russell, working on the foundations of mathematics in the early 1900s, identified a family of paradoxes that share the structure of the Epimenides paradox and that threaten to undermine the entire project of grounding mathematics in logic. The set of all sets that do not contain themselves, does it contain itself? The barber who shaves everyone who does not shave themselves, does he shave himself? These are all versions of the same problem, a system producing a statement about itself that generates an undecidable loop. Russell and Alfred North Whitehead responded by developing type theory, a framework that prevented systems from referring to themselves in the problematic way. You can only talk about objects from a higher level than the one where they exist. Sets can talk about their members, but not about themselves. Statements can describe things, but not themselves in the relevant way. This worked technically, but it felt like a heavy price. Natural language is full of self-reference. People say things like "this sentence is in English," or "everything I say today is provisional," and these do not seem problematic. The type theory solution draws a sharp line that ordinary thought does not actually respect. Kurt Gödel found a way to encode self-reference inside formal arithmetic itself, producing statements that said, in effect, this statement cannot be proved within this system. His incompleteness theorems showed that any sufficiently powerful formal system either is inconsistent or contains true statements it cannot prove. Self-reference, bottled up by type theory, had escaped through mathematics and arrived at the same uncomfortable destination. Epimenides, standing in Crete 2,000 years before Gödel, had stumbled onto something that turned out to matter enormously for the foundations of logic and mathematics. He was probably not thinking about formal systems. He was probably making a cynical remark about his neighbors. But the remark had a structure that turned out to be one of the most productive and troubling structures in the history of thought. Can a system fully describe itself? Can a language contain a complete account of its own properties? Can a mind fully understand the structure of its own reasoning? The Epimenides paradox is the oldest surviving hint that the answer might be no, and that the no might be principled rather than accidental. What is there in your own thinking that your thinking cannot reach? And would you know if there was something? There is a version of the Epimenides paradox that operates in everyday social life, and it is less about formal logic than about the way communities and identities describe themselves. Every group has a story about what it is. A nation has a founding myth and a set of values it claims to embody. A religion has a set of teachings and a community that interprets and lives those teachings. A family has a self-understanding, a sense of what kind of family it is, what it stands for, how it treats people. All of these are self-descriptions. The group is saying something about itself, and the people doing the describing are members of the group. Cretans describing Cretans. The self-description is made from inside the thing being described, which means it is subject to all the same biases, blind spots, and motivated reasoning that affect any insider account. When a nation tells the story of its own history, it tends to emphasize the things that support the self-image it has, and to minimize the things that complicate it. When a religion describes its own tradition, the description is typically made by people who believe in the tradition, which shapes what gets noticed and what gets passed over. When a family tells itself what kind of family it is, the telling is done by the family members, who have reasons to see things in particular ways. The Epimenides problem is not just logical, it is epistemological. Self-descriptions are systematically unreliable not because the describer is dishonest, but because the describer is inside the thing being described and cannot get fully outside it to see it clearly. What would it mean for your own self-understanding to be subject to the same limitation? And who would be in a position to see what you cannot see about yourself from the inside? Braess Paradox. Consider the following description. The smallest positive integer not definable in fewer than 12 words. Count the words in that description. 1. The smallest positive integer not definable in fewer than 12 words. 12 words. So the description defines a specific number, the smallest positive integer that requires at least 12 words to define, and it does so in exactly 12 words. But wait, if that description successfully defines a number, then the number can be defined in 12 words, and the description says the number cannot be defined in fewer than 12 words, meaning it requires 12 or more. 12 words to define it, and the description requires 12 words. So far, no contradiction. But here is where it breaks. We started by looking for a number that cannot be defined in fewer than 12 words. Let us call that number n. The description of n, this smallest positive integer not definable in fewer than 12 words, is itself a definition of n in 12 words, so n can be defined in 12 words, but n was supposed to be the number that cannot be defined in fewer than 12 words, so n can be defined in fewer words than it takes to define it, which contradicts what it is. The paradox was named after G.G. Berry, a librarian at the Bodleian Library in Oxford, who communicated it to Bertrand Russell in 1906. Russell included it in his work on paradoxes, and it became part of the set of self-referential paradoxes that he was trying to resolve through type theory. The problem comes from treating definable in fewer than 12 words as a well-defined mathematical property. For finite mathematical objects like numbers, definability seems like it should be clear. Either a number can be described by a short phrase or it cannot. But the concept of definability, when applied to itself, generates the same kind of self-reference that makes the liar paradox and the Epimenides paradox problematic. One response is to say that definable in fewer than 12 words is not actually a well-defined predicate in the relevant formal sense, because it depends on what counts as a definition, what language you are using, and what the words in that language mean. These are not fixed in the way that, say, being prime is fixed. The predicate has a context dependence that makes it fuzzy enough that the paradox does not arise in a formal system, only in informal language. This is technically correct for most formal mathematical purposes, but it also points at something genuine about informal language that the technical fix sidesteps. When we talk about something being simple or complex, definable or undefinable, expressible or ineffable, we are using concepts that have a self-referential quality built into them. Simplicity is simple to describe, complexity is complex to describe, a thing that is hard to define in hard to define, including in the sentence that says it is hard to define, and this matters beyond logic puzzles. The paradox points at a real limit in self-description. When you try to describe the limits of your own ability to describe things, you run into the same self-referential wall. The most precisely you can characterize what you cannot say is by saying it, which means you just said it, which means you could say it, which means it was not outside your descriptive capacity after all. Philosophers of language have spent considerable effort on this, particularly in the context of what Wittgenstein called the limits of language. His famous line, "Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent," is trying to mark off a space that cannot be described without being changed by the description. But even that sentence describes the space. The silence it prescribes is broken by the prescription. The Berry paradox is the mathematical expression of this limit. Not everything that feels like it should be definable can be defined without contradiction. And not every limit on description can be described without violating itself. What is something you have been trying to put into words for a long time that seems to escape the moment you think you have it? And does the fact that it keeps escaping tell you something about what it is, or just about the limits of words? There is a related puzzle that sits beside the Berry paradox and is worth mentioning. Consider the sentence, "This sentence contains 5 words." Count them. This sentence contains 5 words. 5 words. The sentence is true and self-referential and unparadoxical. Now consider, this sentence contains 10 words. Count, 8 words. The sentence is self-referential and false. Now consider, this sentence contains 8 words. Count, 5 words, also false. Is there a sentence of the form, "This sentence contains n words," that is true for any value of n? Yes, this sentence contains 5 words, is true, but finding it requires a specific number to match the actual word count, and getting that match right requires either luck or counting, and counting is itself a process that the sentence cannot describe while you are doing it. Small puzzles, but they cluster around the same territory as the Braess Paradox, which is the territory where language tries to describe itself and keeps running into problems at the seam. There is a practical version of the Braess Paradox that has nothing to do with mathematics, but everything to do with how people think about their own expertise and the expertise of others. When you are a genuine expert in something, describing what you know takes more words than it takes for a non-expert. Not because your knowledge is harder to express, but because you know more of it. A beginner's description of how to play chess might fit in a paragraph. A grandmaster's description of what they know about chess would fill multiple books, and even then it would leave out the tacit knowledge that cannot easily be put into words at all. Now reverse it. When you are trying to evaluate someone else's expertise from the outside, you have a limited number of words available to characterize what you do not know. The less you know about a subject, the more easily you can summarize your ignorance. I know nothing about organic chemistry can be said in 6 words. But as you learn more organic chemistry, your ignorance becomes more specific, more shaped, more textured, and describing it takes more words. This is why genuine experts are often more uncertain sounding than beginners. They have learned enough to know what they do not know, and describing that is complicated. The beginner's confidence comes partly from not yet knowing what there is to know, and therefore not knowing what to be uncertain about. The Braess Paradox is pointing at something similar. The number that cannot be defined in 12 words turns out to be definable in 12 words. The thing you cannot say turns out to be said. The expertise you cannot describe turns out to be partially described once you try, and every act of articulation reveals a new layer of the inarticulate beneath it. What is it that you know that you cannot fully say? And is the gap between what you know and what you can say getting larger or smaller as you pay more attention to it? Language keeps finding new edges, and the edges keep moving outward, which might be the most honest thing language ever does. The Protagoras Court Paradox. Protagoras was one of the most famous sophists of ancient Athens. A teacher, a rhetorician, someone who made his living teaching young men how to argue effectively, how to win cases in court, how to persuade. He was expensive, and he was good. A young man named Euthyphro came to him wanting to learn. But Euthyphro was poor. He could not pay the full fee up front, so they made a deal. Euthyphro would study under Protagoras. He would pay the fee only when he won his first court case. If he never practiced law, he would owe nothing. The payment was contingent on victory. Euthyphro studied, he learned, and then he did nothing with it. He did not take any cases. The fee was never triggered. Protagoras waited and eventually got impatient. He decided to sue Euthyphro for the money. Now think carefully about what happens in this lawsuit. If Protagoras wins the case, the court has ruled that Euthyphro must pay, so Euthyphro must pay. If Euthyphro wins the case, then Euthyphro has won his first court case, and the original agreement says Euthyphro pays the fee when he wins his first case, so Euthyphro must pay. Protagoras wins, Euthyphro pays. Euthyphro wins, Euthyphro pays. Either way, Euthyphro pays. Protagoras seems to have constructed the perfect lawsuit. Now look at it from Euthyphro's perspective. He has also studied rhetoric. He also sees both outcomes. If Euthyphro wins the case, the court has ruled that he does not have to pay, so he does not pay. If Protagoras wins the case, then Euthyphro has not yet won his first case, and the original agreement says he only pays when he wins his first case. Since he has not won one, the condition has not been met, so he does not pay. Protagoras wins, Euthyphro does not pay. Euthyphro wins, Euthyphro does not pay. Either way, Euthyphro does not pay. Both arguments are internally coherent. Both follow logically from the same agreement and the same 2 possible court outcomes. And they reach opposite conclusions. One says Euthyphro certainly pays. The other says Euthyphro certainly does not pay. Both cannot be right. This is the Protagoras Court Paradox, and it is one of the oldest recorded legal paradoxes. Ancient writers attributed it to Protagoras himself and regarded it as a serious puzzle about the limits of legal reasoning. What the paradox exposes is that the original contract was self-defeating in a very specific way. It created a situation where the legal mechanism meant to resolve the dispute, a court ruling, cannot resolve it without generating a contradiction. Whatever the court decides, one of the parties can point to the decision and derive the opposite conclusion from the same contract. Lawyers would say the contract was ambiguous, or that it had failed to specify which mechanism took precedence when they conflicted, the court ruling or the contractual condition. A well-drafted contract would have made clear whether the court's decision superseded the original agreement or whether the original agreement took precedence even over a contrary court ruling. The ambiguity is the source of the paradox. But this resolution, while practically useful, sidesteps something philosophically interesting. The paradox is not just about a badly drafted contract. It is about the relationship between different levels of rule, between the rule established by contract and the rule established by court. When two levels of rule apply to the same situation and conflict with each other, which level wins? And if the answer depends on another rule, what determines that rule? And what determines that rule? And what determines the one that determines it? Legal systems handle this through hierarchies. Constitutional rules supersede statutory rules, which supersede common law, which supersede contracts, which supersede informal agreements. When levels conflict, the hierarchy determines the winner. But the hierarchy itself is a rule, and something has to establish it. At the top of any legal hierarchy is something that is simply accepted as authoritative, not because a higher rule established it, but because the system has to start somewhere. The Protagoras Paradox is pointing at the bottom of that stack, not the specific contract between Protagoras and Euthyphro, but the general question of what makes any rule authoritative and what happens when two authoritative rules point in opposite directions. Courts resolve this every day without reference to the philosophical problem by making a decision and accepting that someone will be unhappy with it. The decision might be arbitrary in the philosophical sense, not derivable from any principle both parties would accept, but it is still a decision, and the social function of courts is to produce decisions, not to resolve philosophical paradoxes. Whether Euthyphro paid is not recorded. Presumably the matter was settled somehow, but the paradox remains unsettled, because the question it is asking is not about this particular case. It is about what happens at the edges of any system of rules when the rules turn on themselves. What would you do if you were the judge in this case? Not the philosophically correct thing. What would you actually do, in the room, with both of them looking at you? There is a version of the Protagoras Paradox that appears in everyday life without courts or contracts, in the form of self-referential promises and conditional commitments that generate the same irresolvable loop when put under pressure. You promise someone that you will trust their judgment on a particular matter, but only after they have proven themselves trustworthy. They cannot prove themselves trustworthy without you first extending some trust, which requires them to have already proven themselves. The condition for earning the trust requires the trust that the condition is meant to proceed. Or, you commit to being more open in a relationship, but only when you feel safe. Feeling safe requires the openness. The openness requires the safety. Neither can come first, and yet one of them has to. These are not logical paradoxes in the strict sense of the Protagoras case, because they do not generate outright contradictions in a formal sense, but they have the same practical structure. Two conditions are mutually dependent. Each is supposed to follow from the other. Neither can initiate. The commitment goes around in a circle. In the Protagoras case, the contract tried to create a sequence, first the education, then the first case, then the fee, but the lawsuit collapsed the sequence by making the lawsuit itself the first case. The careful temporal ordering broke down. Conditional promises in relationships break down the same way when the conditions are themselves dependent on what the promise was supposed to produce. You cannot get there from here, because here requires already being there. What is a condition you have placed on something in your own life that might itself require what it is meant to precede? And has that condition kept something from starting that might have resolved itself if you had found a way to simply begin? Protagoras filed the suit to force a resolution. Before that, there was no problem. Euthyphro had not violated the contract. He simply had not won a case yet, so the payment condition had not triggered. Inconvenient for Protagoras. Not illegal. The legal action meant to settle things created the contradiction that could not be settled. Sometimes forcing resolution collapses a stable ambiguity into an unstable one. The situation before the lawsuit was frustrating. After it, it was impossible. Whether Protagoras should have filed the suit at all is a question the paradox does not answer. But it suggests the question is always worth asking. The Preface Paradox. An author finishes a book. Not a quick one. Years of work, research, revision, careful checking of sources. Every claim in the book has been scrutinized. Every argument has been tested. Every fact has been verified against the best available evidence. The author believes each sentence. Otherwise, they would not have written it. And then they write the preface. And in the preface, they write something like, "Despite my best efforts, this book almost certainly contains errors for which I alone am responsible." They mean it. Genuinely. They are not being falsely modest. They are being epistemically honest. Careful scholars know that even their most careful work contains mistakes. The history of every field is littered with confident claims that turned out to be wrong. Any author with enough experience knows that some of their sentences, right now, are incorrect, even if they cannot identify which ones. So the author holds two sets of beliefs simultaneously. They believe each individual sentence in the book, and they believe that at least one sentence in the book is false. Both beliefs are rational, both are well-grounded, and they are jointly inconsistent. This is the Preface Paradox, identified by philosopher David Mackinson in 1965, and it puts pressure on a natural assumption about what it means to be rational. We tend to assume that a rational person's belief should be consistent. You should not believe A, and also believe not A. Logical consistency seems like a minimum requirement for being a reasonable person. But the Preface Paradox shows that rational belief can be inconsistent in a very specific and defensible way. The author is being entirely reasonable, and their reasonable beliefs are jointly contradictory. What exactly is going wrong? And is anything going wrong at all? One response is that the author does not actually believe each individual sentence with full confidence. What they believe is something more nuanced, that each sentence is very likely true, that the evidence supports each claim to a high degree, that each claim meets their evidential threshold for assertion, but no individual sentence is held with absolute certainty. And when you aggregate many claims each held with high but not perfect confidence, it becomes quite likely that at least one of them is wrong. On this view, there is no genuine contradiction, just a failure to notice that qualified confidence in each of many claims implies reasonable doubt about the whole set. The preface caveat is consistent with the body of the book if you read both as expressions of calibrated uncertainty rather than absolute belief. This is the standard resolution and it is mostly correct, but it leaves something interesting on the floor. Most of the sentences in the book, when the author reads them back, feel true. Not approximately true. True. The author experiences them as beliefs, not as probability distributions. And the preface belief, at least one of these is wrong, also feels like a genuine belief, not a probability distribution. Two things that feel like straightforward beliefs are inconsistent. Whether or not this creates a formal logical problem, it is a recognizable cognitive situation. You can hold a belief sincerely while knowing at a meta level that beliefs like this one are often wrong. You can be confident in your conclusion while knowing that people who have been just as careful have reached wrong conclusions before. You can believe something and simultaneously believe that you might be one of the people who is wrong about it. Epistemologists call this a tension between first-order belief and higher-order belief. At the first order, you believe P. At the higher order, you believe that your first-order beliefs have a significant error rate. And these two levels do not always communicate with each other in a way that resolves the tension. Scientists are trained to live in this tension as a professional requirement. A scientist publishes a finding while knowing that published findings have a significant replication failure rate, that the specific statistical methods used have known limitations, that the sample might not generalize, that unforeseen confounds might exist. They believe their finding while holding all of that uncertainty simultaneously. The finding goes in the preface as a confident claim and in the limitations section as a qualified one. Most people outside professional epistemically careful contexts do not have the same training, but everyone who thinks carefully about their own beliefs eventually encounters this. You hold views. You know your views have been wrong before. You know people who hold incompatible views with equal confidence. And yet you cannot simply suspend all your views pending resolution of the uncertainty, because you need beliefs to navigate the world. The Preface Paradox is what rational humility looks like from the inside, not the absence of confident belief, but the presence of confident belief alongside knowledge that confident belief is fallible. Holding both at once is uncomfortable. Holding only one of them would be worse. What would you write in the preface to the book of your own most confident beliefs? And would you mean it? There is a version of the Preface Paradox that applies to moral beliefs specifically, and it is worth separating out because the stakes are higher and the discomfort is more acute. Most people with strong moral views, people who believe firmly that certain things are right and certain things are wrong, also have some awareness of the history of moral views, and that history is not encouraging. Things that were widely and sincerely believed to be morally acceptable, slavery, the subordination of women, casual cruelty toward animals, the treatment of various outgroups, are now regarded as obviously wrong. The people who held those beliefs were often thoughtful, well-intentioned and confident. They wrote their moral prefaces with assurance, so a reasonable person looking at this history should conclude that some of their own current moral beliefs, held with similar confidence, will be regarded by future generations as obviously wrong. They do not know which ones. Neither can they identify which sentences in the book are wrong, but the base rate suggests that at least some of their moral confidence is misplaced. This is unsettling in a way that goes beyond the epistemological puzzle. It is not just that your beliefs might be inaccurate, it is that your most confident moral beliefs, the ones you act on, the ones that shape how you treat people, might be the beliefs that future generations will look back on with the same horrified clarity that you look back on the moral failures of the past. And yet you cannot simply suspend your moral beliefs pending their eventual revision. You have to act. Acting requires moral commitments. The tension is irresolvable in principle and has to be navigated in practice without being resolved. The preface paradox in moral life is not, I might be wrong about some minor things. It is, I am probably wrong about something important, in a way I cannot yet see, and I am nonetheless obligated to act on my best current moral understanding. Which moral beliefs of yours are the ones you feel most certain about? And which of those might be in the preface of the moral book that you cannot yet read? The Cold Sun Paradox. About 4 billion years ago, the sun was significantly dimmer than it is today. Astrophysicists calculate that it was putting out roughly 70% of the energy it produces now. That is not a small difference. 70% of current solar output, at the distance Earth sits from the sun, should have produced a planet where the average surface temperature was well below the freezing point of water. Not cold in the way winter is cold enough that the entire surface of the planet should have been locked in ice, from pole to pole, in a permanent frozen state. And yet the geological record shows liquid water on Earth's surface for almost as long as Earth has had a surface. Sedimentary rocks from 3.5 billion years ago can only form in liquid water. There are signs of ocean currents, of rain, of rivers. Early life emerged in liquid water. A frozen planet does not produce sedimentary rocks or early life, so the sun was too faint to keep the planet liquid. And the planet was liquid anyway. Something in the picture is wrong, and it has been wrong since Carl Sagan and George Mullen first clearly articulated the problem in 1972. They called it the faint young sun paradox, and it remains one of the more genuinely unsolved problems in Earth science. Several explanations have been proposed, none of which has achieved full consensus. The most common involves greenhouse gases. Early Earth's atmosphere was very different from today's. Higher concentrations of carbon dioxide, methane, and possibly other greenhouse gases could have trapped enough heat to keep the planet warm, despite the faint sun. Methane in particular is a potent greenhouse gas, and early microbial life was likely producing large quantities of it before oxygen appeared in the atmosphere and destroyed it. The math works out approximately for some combinations of greenhouse gases, but pinning down exactly what the early atmosphere contained is difficult because the geological evidence is sparse and ambiguous. You can reconstruct some things about ancient atmospheres from rock chemistry, from isotope ratios, from the presence or absence of certain minerals that form only under specific conditions. But the record is incomplete, and different research groups working from the same evidence often reach different conclusions about atmospheric composition. Another explanation involves the Earth's surface itself. Early Earth had less land and more ocean than today, and oceans absorb less sunlight than land, which seems counterproductive until you remember that ice reflects more sunlight than ocean. Less land might have meant less ice formation, meaning more sunlight absorbed by dark ocean water, meaning more warmth. The feedback loops in early Earth's climate system are complex enough that small changes in surface composition could have large effects on global temperature. A third possibility is that the Sun was not actually as faint as standard stellar models suggest. Solar models are extremely well tested for the present-day Sun, but their backward extrapolations depend on assumptions about how stars lose mass over time. If the early Sun lost mass more rapidly than standard models assume, it might have been hotter in absolute terms even if it was at the right luminosity for its size, producing more warming than the 70% figure implies. Some researchers have proposed this as a partial solution, though it requires mass loss rates that are higher than what most stellar physicists consider likely. What makes the faint young sun paradox genuinely interesting rather than just a technical puzzle is what it reveals about how complex the Earth's climate system is, and how many independent factors have to cooperate to maintain conditions suitable for life over billions of years. We tend to think of Earth's habitability as a background fact, something that was set up at the beginning and has persisted. The faint young sun paradox shows that habitability has been actively maintained through a web of feedback processes whose details we do not yet fully understand. Early Earth was in a regime where the incoming energy was too low to support liquid water, and it maintained liquid water anyway through some combination of mechanisms that preserved the right conditions despite the wrong inputs. And it did this not for 1,000,000 years or 10 million years, but for billions of years, continuously, without any single mechanism that clearly accounts for all of it. That is a remarkable thing about the planet you live on, not just that conditions were right for life to emerge, but that something kept them approximately right long enough for life to emerge, and then kept them approximately right for the several billion more years it took for that life to become complex. Nobody knows exactly how. The proposed mechanisms are all plausible. None of them is clearly sufficient on its own, and the combination might be different from what any current model describes. What does it tell you about the stability of the conditions you live in that we still do not fully understand how those conditions were maintained for the first half of Earth's history? And what does it say about what is being maintained right now, by processes you cannot see, in ways you have not yet identified? There is one more dimension to the faint young sun paradox that connects it to a broader question about planetary habitability, and why Earth seems so unusually well suited for life. The paradox is, in part, a paradox about feedback. Early Earth was too cold by the naive calculation, and yet it stayed warm. That means something was pushing back against the cooling. Climate systems have what engineers call feedback loops, processes where the output of a system becomes an input that modifies the same system. Negative feedback stabilizes, positive feedback amplifies. For Earth to maintain liquid water despite a faint sun, a negative feedback process must have been operating that counteracted the tendency toward freezing. One candidate is the carbonate-silicate cycle. When carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere drop and the planet cools, chemical weathering of rocks slows down, which means less carbon dioxide gets consumed by rock weathering, which means carbon dioxide accumulates in the atmosphere from volcanic outgassing, which warms the planet back up. When carbon dioxide is high and the planet is warm, weathering accelerates, more carbon dioxide gets consumed, the planet cools. The cycle is slow, operating over millions of years, but it acts as a thermostat. If this is part of what kept early Earth warm, it suggests that Earth has been regulating its own temperature through geochemical feedback for most of its history. Not intentionally, not through any mechanism that resembles planning, but through chemistry that happens to have stabilizing properties. The planet kept itself alive, in a sense, through the same kind of blind feedback that homeostasis uses in biological systems. How much of the stability you take for granted in your own environment is the product of processes like this, running silently in the background, keeping conditions in the range where the things you care about can continue to exist? And what happens if one of those feedback loops breaks? Schrödinger's cat, Erwin Schrödinger, did not like the interpretation of quantum mechanics that was becoming dominant in the late 1920s. He had helped develop the mathematics of quantum mechanics, including the wave equation that bears his name, but he found the interpretation his colleagues were putting on that mathematics deeply troubling. So in 1935, he constructed a thought experiment designed to show how strange the interpretation was by scaling it up from microscopic particles to something everybody could immediately see was absurd. Take a cat. Put the cat in a sealed box. Inside the box, place a small amount of radioactive material with a 50% chance of emitting a particle within 1 hour, a detector, a hammer, and a vial of poison. If the detector registers radioactive decay, the hammer smashes the vial and the cat dies. If no decay occurs in the hour, the cat survives. After 1 hour, without opening the box, what is the state of the cat? According to the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, which Schrodinger was targeting, the radioactive material exists in a superposition of states before measurement. It has both decayed and not decayed until observed. The wave function describing it does not collapse into a definite state until a measurement forces it to. Following the chain of causation, if the radioactive material is in superposition, then the detector is in superposition of having triggered and not having triggered. The hammer is in superposition of having fallen and not having fallen. The vial is in superposition of having broken and not having broken. And the cat is therefore in superposition of having broken and not having broken. And the cat is therefore in superposition of being alive and being dead. According to the interpretation, before you open the box, the cat is simultaneously alive and dead. Schrodinger thought this was ridiculous. A cat is not a quantum particle. A cat is a macroscopic object. Surely a cat is either alive or dead, regardless of whether anyone opens the box. Surely the quantum superposition resolves somewhere in the chain between the radioactive nucleus and the cat. Surely the absurdity of a half-alive, half-dead cat shows that something is wrong with how quantum mechanics is being interpreted. But the Copenhagen interpretation has a response, or rather several responses depending on which version you take. One is that the superposition does resolve somewhere in the measurement chain, at the point where a quantum system interacts with a macroscopic measuring device. Another is that the cat itself acts as a kind of observer and resolves the superposition. Another is that the superposition is a description of our knowledge, not of physical reality, and asking about the cat's state before opening the box is a category error, like asking about the sound a falling tree makes when no one is there to hear it. The many worlds interpretation avoids the measurement problem differently. When you open the box, the universe splits. In one branch, you find a live cat. In another, you find a dead cat. Both outcomes occur. Both are real. You, as the observer, become entangled with one branch and experience one outcome, while another version of you experiences the other. No wave function collapse, no privileged observer, just branching. What makes Schrödinger's cat interesting to keep thinking about, decades after the basic physics was worked out, is what it reveals about the relationship between quantum mechanics and the macroscopic world you actually live in. Quantum effects are real. They are measured and confirmed in laboratories constantly, but they do not obviously scale up to cats and tables and people. The transition from the quantum world to the classical world you experience is called the measurement problem, and it is not fully resolved. Physicists work in quantum mechanics every day without needing the measurement problem to be solved, because the mathematical formalism works regardless of what interpretation you adopt. You get the right predictions whether you believe in wave function collapse, many worlds, pilot wave theory, relational quantum mechanics, or none of the above. The interpretation is philosophically significant, but experimentally invisible. Different interpretations of the same mathematics give the same experimental predictions, but the cat is still in the box, not literally. Schrödinger meant the experiment as a reductio, a way of making the strangeness visible by scaling it to something familiar. He succeeded too well. The cat became famous, and the question it poses about where quantum strangeness ends and ordinary classical reality begins has not been answered in a way that satisfies everyone thinking carefully about it. If quantum mechanics is a complete description of reality, then everything is subject to it, including cats, including you. Your atoms obey quantum rules. Your electrons are in superposition until measured. Whether you are in superposition in any meaningful sense is the question. And the honest answer is that nobody is completely sure. Where do you think the quantum world ends and the ordinary world begins? And is the boundary a real feature of nature, or something you impose because the alternative is too strange to hold in your head? There is a version of Schrödinger's cat that applies to decisions rather than quantum states, and it captures something recognizable about a specific kind of uncertainty that has nothing to do with physics. Before you open a letter, before you make the phone call, before you read the message, the thing you are afraid to find out exists in a kind of superposition. Not literally, not quantum mechanically, but experientially. You do not know whether the test came back positive or negative. You do not know whether the person feels the way you hope they do. You do not know whether you got the thing you wanted. And as long as you do not open the box, both possibilities coexist in your experience of the situation. People sometimes deliberately do not open the box, not because they have forgotten, because they are not ready to collapse the superposition. The alive and dead state of not knowing is more bearable than the definiteness of either outcome. As long as you have not read the message, there is still hope. As long as you have not made the call, you have not been rejected. The cat is alive as long as you do not look. This is not irrational. Exactly. People have genuine reasons to delay finding out things that might hurt them, but it has the same structure as Schrodinger's thought experiment. Observation collapses the superposition. Before observation, the thing is indeterminate. After, it is determined, and the determined state might be worse than the indeterminate one felt. What Schrodinger was pointing at physically is that quantum mechanics makes observation do real work. Looking at the radioactive atom genuinely changes what the atom is, not just what you know about it. Whether delayed observation of your own life has anything similarly real about it is a different question, but the feeling is the same. Some boxes are genuinely hard to open, and sitting with the uncertainty is sometimes what people actually choose. What are you not looking at right now that would collapse into something definite if you did, and is the reason you are not looking a good one, or just a comfortable one? The heat-death paradox. The second law of thermodynamics is one of the most reliable laws in all of physics. Entropy increases. Systems move from ordered states to disordered ones. Heat flows from hot objects to cold ones, not the other way around. Energy spreads out. Structures dissolve. Over time, any closed system will reach a state of maximum entropy, where everything is uniformly distributed. Nothing is more concentrated than anything else. No gradients exist, no work can be done. This endpoint is called thermodynamic equilibrium, and for the universe as a whole, it is sometimes called the heat death. If the universe has existed forever, it should already be in this state. Maximum entropy. Total equilibrium. No stars, no planets, no gradients of any kind, no complexity, just uniform, featureless, maximally disordered matter, and radiation spread evenly through a vast and dark expanse. And yet here we are. Stars are burning, galaxies are spinning, complexity exists at every scale from subatomic to cosmic. Structures persist, gradients maintain. Life, which is a spectacular violation of the tendency toward equilibrium, exists and thinks and notices that it exists. This is sometimes called the heat-death paradox, though it is less a paradox in the strict logical sense and more a deep tension between what thermodynamics predicts and the obvious complexity of the universe we find ourselves in. The resolution is that the universe is not infinitely old. Current cosmological models place the origin of the universe at approximately 13.8 billion years ago in the Big Bang. The universe has not had infinite time to reach equilibrium. It started in an extremely low entropy state, highly concentrated energy in an extremely small space, and it has been moving toward equilibrium ever since. We exist in the intermediate period, the long, slow relaxation toward heat death that is still billions and possibly trillions of years from its endpoint. This raises an immediate question that is harder to answer. Why did the universe start in such a low entropy state? Thermodynamics tells you that low entropy states are extremely improbable. Most states are high entropy states. Starting from scratch with a random universe, you would expect to find maximum entropy immediately. The fact that we are not in maximum entropy, the fact that we started with a Big Bang rather than a uniform distribution, seems to require explanation. Physicist Roger Penrose has written about this at length, calculating that the probability of a universe with the initial conditions of ours, specifically the extremely low entropy of the Big Bang, is incomprehensibly small. Not just unlikely, staggeringly, mind-bendingly improbable. The kind of improbable that defies ordinary intuitions about what improbable means. Several explanations have been proposed. Some physicists invoke a multiverse, an ensemble of universes with different initial conditions, of which ours happens to be one of the improbably ordered ones. The argument is anthropic. We can only exist in a universe with low enough entropy to permit complexity, so the very fact of our existence selects for a universe with the properties ours has. Other universes in the ensemble might be at maximum entropy, but nobody is there to notice. Others propose that quantum cosmology might explain why the Big Bang had the initial conditions it did, that there is something about the physics of the very early universe that naturally produces low entropy starting states, without invoking an ensemble or anthropic selection. Still others find the question itself strange, arguing that entropy is a property of a system relative to a macro state description, and that asking why the universe had low entropy initially is like asking why the universe was what it was, rather than something else, a question that might not have a physical answer because it is asking about boundary conditions from outside any framework that could supply them. What the heat-death paradox ultimately points at is the arrow of time. Why does time seem to go in one direction? Why is the future different from the past? Physics at the microscopic level is mostly time-symmetric. The equations work equally well forward and backward. The asymmetry between past and future, the fact that you can remember the past but not the future, the fact that broken eggs do not reassemble themselves, is traced back to the thermodynamic arrow, to the fact that entropy increases. And entropy increases because we started in a low entropy state and have been moving away from it. So the past-future asymmetry, the reason time feels like it flows in a direction, traces back to the Big Bang. Time has a direction because entropy has a direction. And entropy has a direction because the universe started somewhere it is slowly moving away from. Whether that starting point was inevitable, improbable, or the result of selection from a larger ensemble is still genuinely contested. And somewhere in the direction the universe is slowly drifting toward, trillions of years from now, is the state where none of this complexity exists anymore. Where no questions get asked because there is no one to ask them. Where the arrow of time points nowhere because nothing is changing. What does it mean to exist in the middle of that long, slow process, knowing where it starts and roughly where it ends, and having no idea exactly where you are in it? There is a personal version of the heat-death paradox that has nothing to do with cosmology and everything to do with how energy and order behave in human systems over time. Any organization, relationship, or creative project starts with a burst of energy. Low entropy in the thermodynamic metaphor, high concentration of effort and attention and enthusiasm. Over time, without continued input, things diffuse. Attention spreads to other things. Enthusiasm becomes familiarity. The initial structure that was built with such effort starts to require maintenance just to stay where it is, and eventually, even maintenance cannot keep it from drifting toward a more disordered state. Physicists would say you cannot beat the second law. You can locally decrease entropy in your project, your relationship, your organization, but only by increasing entropy elsewhere, by consuming energy that came from somewhere. The order you maintain is bought at a cost. What this means practically is that maintenance is not free. Keeping something ordered requires ongoing input, and the required input grows over time as more things need maintaining, and the energy to maintain them does not grow at the same rate. Most people learn this not from thermodynamics, but from experience. The creative project that was exciting at the start gets harder to sustain at the same level of energy. The relationship that felt effortless early on requires deliberate attention to keep from drifting. The organization that was tight and focused when it was small develops inefficiencies as it grows. None of this is surprising from a thermodynamic perspective. Local order in a universe, trending toward disorder, requires constant work. The work is just the price of the order. What would you put continued energy into, knowing that the energy is the only thing keeping the order from dissolving? And is that thing worth the energy you would have to keep spending? The liar paradox. Say this sentence is false. Sit with it for a moment. Not the words themselves, but what happens when you try to assign them a truth value. If the sentence is true, then what it says is the case. And what it says is that the sentence is false. So, if it is true, it is false. If the sentence is false, then what it says is not the case. And what it says is that the sentence is false. So if it is false, then it is not false, which means it is true. True means false. False means true. Neither assignment is stable. The sentence oscillates. collapsing into its own opposite every time you try to anchor it. And it has been doing this since at least the 4th century BC, when the philosopher Eubulides of Miletus first recorded a version of it, and probably long before that. For 2,500 years, some of the sharpest minds in philosophy and mathematics have tried to kill the liar paradox. It keeps surviving, not because nobody is smart enough to solve it, but because every proposed solution either introduces new problems, restricts language in ways that feel too heavy, or survives as a local patch while the paradox reappears in a slightly different form nearby. The most natural response is to say the sentence is meaningless, not true, not false, just a grammatically well-formed string of words that does not actually say anything. The problem with this is that the sentence looks meaningful. Every word in it has a clear meaning. The sentence is in English. The grammar is correct. Calling it meaningless requires invoking a distinction between sentences that look meaningful and sentences that are meaningful, and working out exactly what that distinction is turns out to be very hard. Alfred Tarski tried a more technical solution in the 1930s. He argued that you cannot talk about truth in the same language you are using to make true or false statements. You need a meta-language to talk about the object language. So when you say this sentence is false, you are mixing levels, using the same language to both make a statement and evaluate the truth of statements, and this mixing is what generates the paradox. A properly stratified language prevents it. This works as a technical solution for formal languages. But it feels like a workaround rather than an explanation. Natural language is not stratified. People talk about the truth of sentences in the same language they use to make those sentences. And in natural language, the paradox arises naturally, without any violation of language rules that ordinary speakers would recognize. Bertrand Russell proposed type theory, which stratifies objects and statements about objects into hierarchical levels. Similar move, similar trade-off. It prevents the paradox by restricting what you can say, but the restriction is not one that natural language actually imposes. What makes the liar paradox philosophically important rather than just philosophically annoying is what it suggests about the limits of any formal system powerful enough to talk about truth. Kurt Gödel, developing his incompleteness theorems, used a construction that encodes something very similar to the liar paradox inside arithmetic. He found a statement in the language of arithmetic that essentially says this statement is not provable within this system. If the system is consistent, the statement is true but unprovable. If the system proves it, the system is inconsistent. The paradox is not killable by putting it inside a formal system. It survives and generates incompleteness. So the liar paradox is not just a curiosity about self-reference. It is pointing at something fundamental about the relationship between language, truth, and provability. Any sufficiently expressive system can formulate statements about itself, and those self-referential statements generate problems. The problems take different forms in different systems, but they keep appearing, and the cleanest solutions keep feeling like they are patching the leak in one place while the water finds another way through. What is strange is how simple the paradox is. 3 words, this sentence is false. No technical machinery required. Just the bare structure of self-reference applied to a truth predicate. And from that simplicity, 2,500 years of productive confusion. Most of the big problems in philosophy have a similar texture to this. Not exotic, not requiring specialist knowledge to understand. Just a simple observation that turns out to have no clean resolution, no matter how carefully you look at it. Does that tell you something about where the real problems are? Not in the complicated corners of technical systems, but in the ordinary language you use every day, which contains more knots than it shows. There is a version of the liar paradox that appears in everyday human interaction, not as a logical problem, but as a social and psychological one. And it shows up in the experience of someone who is deeply ambivalent about something saying something about their own state of mind. Consider a person who says, "I do not know what I want." On the surface, this looks like a simple, honest expression of uncertainty. But look more carefully. Saying, "I do not know what I want," is itself a kind of knowing. They know they are uncertain. They know that the uncertainty is about their own desires. They have characterized their own mental state well enough to describe it in a sentence. If they truly did not know anything about their own desires, They would not be able to say, I do not know what I want, as opposed to, I want nothing, or I want everything, or just silence. So knowing what they want is present in the act of saying they do not know it. Not completely, but partially, and the statement, taken literally, is not quite accurate. They know something, they just cannot fully articulate it, or they cannot act on it, or they cannot commit to it. The I do not know what I want is a real statement about a real experience, but it contains more knowledge than it admits to. This is not the liar paradox exactly, because it does not generate a clean logical contradiction, but it has the same self-undermining structure. The statement describing an absence contains the thing it says is absent. The person who says they know nothing knows something. The sentence that says, I am lying, might be telling the truth. The structure keeps appearing in different costumes. What is something you have said about yourself that might be less accurate than it sounds, not because you were lying, but because the act of saying it revealed something the statement seemed to deny? And is the gap between what you said and what you showed in saying it something worth paying attention to? The liar paradox never resolves. Neither do the people who contain versions of it. And perhaps that is the most honest description of what self-knowledge actually is. Not a clear picture, but a self-referential loop that reveals something new every time you follow it around. One last thing. Remove the word this, and the paradox disappears. A sentence about the sentence on page 47 is either true or false. Only when a sentence refers to itself does the loop form. Self-reference is what makes language unusual. It is the thing that can contain itself. And the liar paradox is where that containment causes trouble. The price of having a language rich enough to be useful is that it becomes rich enough to say this sentence is false. Nobody has found a way to have one without the other. The Crocodile Paradox. A crocodile steals a child from the riverbank. The father, desperate, begs for the child's return. The crocodile, in an unusual mood, offers a deal. Guess correctly what I will do with your child, and I will return them. Guess incorrectly, and I keep them. The father thinks carefully and says, You will not return my child. The crocodile is immediately stuck. If the father's guess is correct, then the crocodile will not return the child, which means the crocodile must return the child, because the deal says a correct guess gets the child returned. But if the crocodile returns the child, then the father's guess was wrong, because the father said the child would not be returned. If the guess was wrong, the crocodile keeps the child. But if the crocodile keeps the child, the guess was correct, so the child must be returned. Around and around. If the father's guess is incorrect, then the crocodile will return the child. But the father guessed the child would not be returned. And if the child is returned, the guess was wrong, which means the crocodile should keep the child. But if the crocodile keeps the child, the guess was correct, which means the child must be returned. Every path through the logic contradicts itself. The crocodile cannot fulfill the terms of the deal regardless of what it does. Not because the crocodile is cunning or the father is clever, but because the structure of the promise made the deal impossible to honor before either of them understood what they had agreed to. Ancient writers knew this paradox. Versions of it appear in Greek and Roman texts. The name comes from the crocodile framing, but the logical structure is the same as the Protagoras court case. A conditional promise whose fulfillment condition makes the promise self-defeating. What makes the crocodile paradox slightly different from the Protagoras case is the directness of the self-reference. Protagoras' paradox involves two levels, a contract and a court ruling, each of which generates an argument about who pays. The crocodile's deal involves only one level, but loops back on itself immediately. The father's guess is not about something separate from the deal. His guess is about what the crocodile will do under this very deal, which means the guess is part of the mechanism that determines whether the guess is correct. This is what makes the deal undoable. Any deal where the terms include a prediction about the term's own outcome creates this loop. The prediction is about the deal. The deal's execution depends on the prediction. The prediction depends on the deal. Nothing external anchors the system. It floats free of any determinate resolution. Logicians classify this as a version of self-referential paradox, in the same family as the liar paradox, a statement about itself that generates instability. Here the statement is the father's guess, and the instability is in the deal that gave the guess its meaning. Whether there is a principled way for the crocodile to honor the deal is a question several ancient philosophers tried to answer. Some said the crocodile should keep the child regardless, since any guess by the father generates a contradiction, and the father has therefore not actually guessed correctly in the relevant sense. Others said the crocodile should return the child regardless, since the paradox means no clean resolution is available, and generosity is the only remaining option. Neither answer is satisfying, and neither was meant to be. The paradox was used in ancient rhetoric training to illustrate the dangers of ill-formed agreements and the limits of logical resolution in situations involving self-reference. Modern contract law sidesteps this by refusing to enforce genuinely self-contradictory agreements. A court faced with the crocodile's deal would likely declare it void for impossibility, acknowledge the paradox, and then make a practical judgment about what to do based on principles outside the terms of the deal itself. The law's solution to irresolvable logical problems is usually to step outside the logic and make a decision anyway, which is not philosophically satisfying, but is practically necessary. Paradoxes do not resolve themselves. People have to live in spite of them. What would you do if you were the crocodile? Not the logical thing. What you would actually do, in the moment, looking at the father. There is a version of the crocodile paradox that appears in human negotiation and conflict, not as a logical puzzle, but as a structural feature of certain kinds of conditional offers that make themselves impossible to fulfill. You have probably experienced something like this. Someone offers to trust you if you prove you are trustworthy. But proving you are trustworthy requires them to first extend some trust, which is what they said you have to earn first. The condition for earning the thing you need requires already having the thing you need to earn, or a relationship where one person says they will open up emotionally when they feel safe, and safety requires the other person to be open and vulnerable first, but the other person is waiting for the first person to be open before they take that risk. Both are waiting for a condition that only the other can create. Neither can start. The deal, like the crocodiles, cannot be honored not because anyone is being dishonest, but because the structure of the offer makes fulfillment impossible. These situations do not always look paradoxical from the inside. They feel like ordinary standoffs, ordinary negotiations, ordinary conflicts about who goes first. But sometimes the reason they feel unresolvable is precisely this structure. The condition for fulfillment depends on its own fulfillment. The guess includes itself in what it is a guess about. The way out is usually the same as the practical resolution in the crocodile case. Stop trying to resolve the logic. Step outside it. Make a decision based on something other than the terms of the deal. One person extends trust without the guarantee. One person opens up without the assurance. The logical circle is broken not by finding a resolution within it, but by refusing to stay inside it. The child in the river does not have time for the crocodile to think through the paradox. Someone has to act. What circular deal are you in the middle of right now, where the resolution requires stepping outside the terms rather than honoring them? And which direction would you step if you decided to move? One last thing worth noting. The paradox is generated by the specific content of the father's guess, not by the deal structure alone. If the father had guessed "you will return my child," there would be no paradox. The loop only forms when the guess predicts the deal will not be honored. The father, perhaps unknowingly, chose the only guess that could make the crocodile's position impossible. In any deal where someone has to guess what you will do, the guesser can sometimes choose a guess that loops back on itself in a way that makes your position impossible, regardless of what you do. Not by being smarter, by finding the one guess that closes the circle. Whether that is a useful observation or just a strange feature of the structure of promises depends on whether you are the crocodile or the father.